Hey you! Yes, you the one who just got comfortable, maybe pulled the blanket a little higher, maybe turned the brightness down on your screen. Welcome back. Or if this is your first time here, welcome for the very first time. Either way, I am really glad you're here tonight. Now before we go any further, I want to ask you something a little strange. When was the last time you thought about a toilet? Not used one, obviously you do that, but actually thought about one, about where it came from, about what it says about the world we live in. Because here is something that most history books skip right past the way humans have handled their most private, most basic bodily needs. Tells us almost everything about who they were, their values, their fears, who they thought mattered, and who they thought did not. A civilization's bathroom is not just a bathroom, it is a mirror, and some of what that mirror reflects is going to genuinely surprise you tonight. If this kind of storytelling is something you enjoy, the kind that pulls you gently into history and leaves you quietly amazed before you fall asleep, then taking a moment to like this video or leave a small comment below means more than you know. It is how more people find their way here on quiet nights just like this one. And if you want to tell me where you're watching from right now, I would love that. Whether it is your bedroom, your couch, somewhere far from home, drop it in the comments. Every single one of those little notes makes this feel a little less like a broadcast and a little more like a conversation. Now settle in, turn the lights soft if you have not already, maybe let a fan run gently in the background, and let tonight's story begin. Here is something that very few people realize. The word hygiene does not come from a doctor or a scientist or a king. It comes from Hygeia, a goddess. Specifically, she was the ancient Greek goddess of health and cleanliness, the daughter of Asclepius, the god of medicine. And that small detail is actually the whole story in miniature. Because for most of human history, cleanliness was not a medical concept. It was a spiritual one. It was a social one. It was above all else a matter of power. Think about it this way. Across thousands of years and dozens of civilizations, ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, medieval Europe, the courts of Versailles, every single one of them had rule about cleanliness. But those rules were almost never just about health. Egyptian priests shaved their entire bodies and bathed twice a day, twice a night, not because they understood bacteria, but because purity was required to stand before the gods. In ancient Rome, the public bathhouse, the thermae, was not simply a place to wash off the day's dirt. It was a place where senators and citizens sat side by side, where deals were made, gossip was shared, and social standing was quietly negotiated. In the courts of medieval Europe, having access to clean water, real running warm water, was one of the clearest signals that you were someone who mattered. And those who did not have that access were made to feel in ways both subtle and not so subtle that their lack of cleanliness was a reflection of their lack of worth. That is not a coincidence. That is a system. Now here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Most of us grow up with a mental image of history that looks something like this: ancient people were dirty. Medieval people were very dirty. And then somewhere around the 20th century we all figured out soap and everything got better. But that image is almost completely wrong. And tonight, over the course of this series, we're going to dismantle it piece by piece. We're going to travel from the remarkably sophisticated drainage systems of Mohenjodaro, a city that was planned and built over 4,000 years ago, all the way to the surprisingly filthy corridors of the Palace of Versailles, one of the most celebrated buildings in all of human history. We're going to meet the man whose official job title was Groom of the Stool, a position so intimate and so powerful that some of the most ambitious men in England competed for it. We're going to talk about what people actually used before toilet paper, and some of those answers are going to make you laugh, some are going to make you cringe, and at least one of them is going to make you quietly grateful for whatever is sitting in your bathroom cabinet right now. We're going to revisit the summer of 1858 in London, when the city's own river became so overwhelmingly foul that Parliament itself was forced to adjourn, and we're going to end somewhere perhaps unexpected in the present day, where nearly 2.5 billion people on this planet still do not have access to a safe, clean toilet. Not 2.5 billion people in some distant past. 2.5 billion people right now tonight as you settle in under your blanket. But before any of that, before the Romans and the plague and the perfume and the pipes, I want to sit with you here for just a moment. Because the real question at the heart of all of this history is a simple one. Why did it take so long? Humans have always been intelligent. Humans have always been creative. So why did it take thousands of years, brilliant, resourceful civilization building thousands of years, to arrive at something as basic and as essential as clean running water and a private place to use the bathroom? The answer, when you look closely at the evidence, is not that people were ignorant. It is that the people who could have solved these problems for everyone often did not see everyone as worth solving them for. Clean water was available to those who could pay. Private sanitation existed for those with the right bloodline. The technology in many cases was already there. What was missing was not the knowledge. What was missing was the will to share it. That pattern, that gap between what was possible and who was allowed to benefit from it, runs through this entire history like a thread. It surfaces in ancient Rome, where spectacular public toilets sat alongside private ones reserved for the wealthy. It appears in Victorian London, where disease swept through working-class neighbourhoods, while the upper classes lived in comfort behind clean tiled walls. And it does not disappear when we reach the present day. Historian Virginia Smith, in her landmark study on the history of cleanliness, put it this way, not in those exact words, but in the spirit of her research. Cleanliness has always been less about biology and more about belonging. To be clean in almost every era of human history was to signal that you were part of the group that mattered. To be unclean, whether by poverty, by circumstance, or simply by lack of access, was to be quietly, persistently excluded. That is a heavy thought, but it is also a freeing one, because once you see that pattern clearly, you start to see history very differently. You stop asking why were people so dirty back then, and you start asking who decided what clean meant, and what did they get out of that definition. Those are the questions that are going to guide us tonight. So here is what I want you to do. Take one slow breath. Let your shoulders drop a little. Because the story we're about to tell together is not just about toilets and bathtubs and ancient sewer systems, though honestly, some of those details alone are worth staying awake for. It is about human beings across all of recorded time trying to make sense of their own bodies, their own communities, their own ideas about who deserves comfort and who deserves dignity. It is in the truest sense the story of all of us, and it begins not in Rome, not in Greece, not in any of the grand civilizations you might expect. It begins in a city most people have never heard of, buried beneath the dust of modern-day Pakistan, where archaeologists once uncovered something so astonishing, so far ahead of its time, that it quietly rewrote everything historians thought they knew about when human beings first decided that where you put your waste actually mattered. That city is called Mohenjodaro, and what they found there is where our story truly starts. Picture this for a moment. You're standing in the middle of a city. A real city, not a cluster of huts, not a farming village, but an actual planned urban settlement, with wide streets laid out in a careful grid, with 2-story homes built from fired brick with public gathering spaces, marketplace stalls and a water system sophisticated enough that even modern engineers stop and stare at its blueprints in quiet disbelief. Now imagine that this city exists around 4,600 years ago. That is not a typo. 4,600 years ago, roughly 1,000 years before the height of ancient Egypt's Pyramid Age, about 1,500 years before Rome was even a thought, there was already a city on this earth where people walked home through clean-swept streets, entered their own private homes and used a toilet that drained through a clay pipe into a shared underground sewer. The name of that city is Mohenjodaro, and I genuinely believe that if most people knew what archaeologists found there, it would quietly rearrange everything they thought they understood about how advanced ancient civilizations really were. Mohenjodaro sits today in the Sindh province of modern-day Pakistan. Its name, given by the people who eventually settled over its ruins, means Mound of the Dead in the Sindhi language. A little grim, honestly, for a place that was once one of the most vibrant cities on the planet. At its peak, around 2,500 before the Common Era, Mohenjodaro was home to somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 people. That made it, in its moment, one of the largest cities in the entire ancient world, comparable in size and sophistication to anything in Mesopotamia or Egypt, but completely separate in its development. Its own flowering of civilization grown from its own soil. It covered close to 500 acres. Its streets were laid on a north-south, east-west grid, the same basic logic we still use today. Its buildings were constructed from standardized baked bricks, each one the same precise dimensions throughout the entire city. Think about that standardized building materials, a concept we tend to associate with modern manufacturing already being used 4.5 millennia ago. But here is what I really want to talk about tonight. Because when archaeologists first began excavating Mohenjodaro in the 1920s, they expected to find something broadly similar to other ancient sites. Few remarkable artifacts, perhaps some evidence of early tools, maybe a temple or two. What they found instead stopped them cold. Almost every house, not the palaces, not the temples, but ordinary residential homes had its own private bathing area, its own private toilet, connected by clay brick pipes to a shared drainage system that ran beneath the streets out of the city and away from the living population. Sir Mortimer Wheeler, one of the great archaeologists of the 20th century, who worked extensively on the Indus Valley sites in the 1940s, put it plainly after he saw the sanitation infrastructure firsthand. He said the quality of the sanitary arrangements at Mohenjodaro could well be envied by many parts of the world even in his own time. In his own time, the 1940s. Let that settle for a second. The man who had spent a career studying some of the world's oldest civilizations looked at a drainage system built over 4,000 years before he was born and said this is better than what a lot of places have right now. And he was not exaggerating. The drains at Mohenjodaro were built from precisely laid brick cut at about 2 feet below ground level, with U-shaped bottoms and inspection openings at regular intervals, so that maintenance workers could access them periodically for cleaning. There were cesspools at the intersections of major drains with steps built down into them for the workers who went in to clear blockages. The city had more than 700 freshwater wells, one for every small block of homes supplying water, not just for drinking and cooking, but for the flush-like system that moved waste through the pipes and out of homes. By around 2,700 before the Common Era, so roughly the same era as the construction of the Egyptian pyramids at Giza Mohenjo-Daro, had standardized earthenware plumbing pipes joined together with asphalt sealant to prevent leaks. Asphalt sealant on plumbing pipes. In 2,700 before the Common Era. You know, we have this tendency, and I include myself here, to think of human progress as a straight upward line. We imagine our ancestors as slightly less clever, slightly less capable, slowly working their way toward the brilliance of the modern age. Mohenjodaro does not fit that story. It insists on something more complicated and honestly more interesting, that the capacity for sophisticated thinking about public health and community infrastructure has been in us for a very, very long time. We just have not always chosen to use it. Now, before we spend the entire night in one city, I want to take a short detour further west to Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the region we now call Iraq. Because Mesopotamia holds a different piece of this early sanitation story, one that is perhaps less visually spectacular than Mohenjodaro, but in many ways more honest about the messy, complicated reality of how early cities actually dealt with human waste. The earliest confirmed toilet so far discovered anywhere on Earth dates to around 3200 before the Common Era. It was found in the ancient city of Uruk, one of the first true cities in history in what is now southern Iraq. It was in its simplest description a pit, a carefully constructed pit lined with ceramic rings to contain the waste and allow liquid to seep gradually into the surrounding soil, but a pit nonetheless. There was no pipe, no flush, no system carrying waste away to somewhere else. It sat beneath the toilet seat and someone periodically had to deal with what accumulated there. By the second millennium before the Common Era, so roughly around the time of the great Babylonian empires, archaeologists have found that in well-excavated Mesopotamian neighborhoods like ancient Nippur and Ur, something rather sobering was true. Fewer than half of the houses had any toilet at all. Fewer than half. Modern public health researchers have actually studied this. The current data suggests that for sanitation infrastructure to meaningfully improve community health, a city needs at least 75% of its households connected to clean waste management systems. Mesopotamia never reached that threshold in any neighborhood we have found. So you had a civilization that invented writing, that developed some of the earliest legal codes, that built remarkable cities, and traded across vast distances, and yet never fully solved the problem of what to do with human waste at the scale that truly mattered for public health. I find that genuinely fascinating and perhaps a little sobering, because it suggests that ingenuity in one area does not automatically translate to ingenuity in another. Mesopotamian cities had builders capable of constructing palaces. They had scholars capable of recording astronomical observations. But the political will, or perhaps the cultural priority to ensure that every household had adequate sanitation, that never quite arrived. And you can draw a fairly straight line from that reality to the disease burden those cities carried. Intestinal parasites were widespread. Water contamination was a persistent killer. Life expectancy in Mesopotamian cities, while difficult to calculate precisely, was significantly constrained by preventable illness that better sanitation infrastructure could have addressed. Now I want to come back to Mohenjodaro one more time because the city has one more thing to tell us something that is equal parts beautiful and haunting. Around 1900. Before the Common Era, Mohenjodaro was abandoned. Not slowly, not gradually, but with a kind of abruptness that still puzzles historians today. When archaeologists excavated the upper layers of the site, they found human skeletons lying in the streets, some face down, arms stretched, as though death arrived without warning. No evidence of invasion was ever conclusively proven. No signs of a great fire, no clear record of war. The most widely accepted theories now point to environmental collapse, the shifting course of the Indus River, prolonged drought, perhaps a catastrophic flood in the city's final years that undermined everything the people there had built. Gregory Possehl, an Indus Valley specialist from the University of Pennsylvania, spent decades studying the collapse and came to a conclusion that I think is worth sitting with on a quiet night like this one. He said in essence around 1900, before the Common Era the culture simply changed. What drove that nobody knows. Nobody knows. a city of 40,000 people with running water in private homes with underground sewers and standardized plumbing pipes, and nearly 800 freshwater wells, and it vanished into silence. And 4,000 years later we're still standing over the ruins asking what happened. There is something in that story that I think reaches past history and into something more personal. We tend to assume that progress once made stays made, that a civilization advanced enough to build what Mohenjodaro built cannot simply disappear, but it can, and it did. And the lesson that particular silence leaves behind is one that echoes across every civilization we're going to visit tonight, from the grandeur of ancient Rome to the strange filth of Versailles to the transformation of the 19th century. Progress in sanitation has never been automatic. It has never been inevitable. Every time human beings figured out a better way to handle this most basic need, there was always a risk, sometimes realized, sometimes not, that the knowledge would be lost or ignored or simply left behind as something only certain people deserved access to. And that brings us to a civilization that in many ways represents the absolute pinnacle of ancient sanitation engineering. A civilization that looked at what Mohenjodaro had achieved with private household plumbing and decided to take it to an entirely different scale, not just for individual homes, but for entire cities, for hundreds of thousands of people stretching across an empire that spanned 3 continents. A civilization that built a sewer so enormous, so well constructed that it is still to this very day carrying water beneath the streets of a modern capital city. I am talking, of course, about Rome, and the story of Roman toilets is, well, let us just say, it is not entirely what you might expect. There is genius in it, yes. There is engineering that will genuinely take your breath away. But there is also a shared sponge on a stick. And once you hear about that, you will never quite look at the idea of communal facilities the same way again. Somewhere beneath the streets of modern Rome right now tonight, water is moving through a tunnel. A tunnel that was first carved out of volcanic stone around 600 years before the birth of Christ. A tunnel so large that, according to the Greek geographer Strabo, a hay wagon fully loaded could be driven through it without scraping the walls. A tunnel so well built that when Pliny the Elder, Rome's great naturalist and writer of the 1st century, sat down to list the achievements of Roman civilization, he did not pick the Colosseum. He did not pick the aqueducts. He did not pick the roads that stretched to the edges of the known world. He called the sewer system, the most noteworthy of all Rome's achievements, the sewer. The man looked at one of the greatest empires in human history and said, "The thing I am most impressed by is what you built underground. That tunnel is the Cloaca Maxima. In Latin, those words translate simply as the greatest drain. And there is something almost endearing about that name. The Romans, who gave such majestic titles to their emperors and their gods, looked at their greatest feat of urban engineering and just called it exactly what it was. The greatest drain. No poetry, no mythology, just the truth. Construction began according to Roman tradition under King Tarquinius Priscus, the 5th king of Rome, ruling around 616 to 579 before the Common Era. At that time, the land between Rome's famous hills was not the gleaming civic heart of an empire. It was a swamp, a low-lying, flood-prone, mosquito-ridden marsh that flooded every time the Tiber River rose after heavy rain. The vision that Tarquinius had to drain that swamp, fill it in, and build the Roman Forum on top of it required moving an enormous amount of water somewhere it could not come back from, and so they built the cloaca. Workers, a mixture of slaves and ordinary Roman labourers, carved trenches through the earth and lined them with massive blocks of volcanic tuff stone, each block roughly 1.25 meters tall and 30 centimetres thick. The initial channel ran about 100 meters, carrying the runoff from the surrounding hills down and away into the Tiber River. What started as an open-air canal, gradually over the following centuries was roofed over, expanded, connected to other drains across the city, and eventually, by the 2nd century, before the Common Era, transformed into a fully enclosed underground sewer system stretching 1,600 meters through the city's heart. At its most developed parts of the Cloaca Maxima were more than 4 meters tall and 3 meters wide. Can I just pause on that for a moment? 4 meters tall, that is higher than the ceiling in most modern homes. Underground, built by hand, 2,600 years ago. And the extraordinary part is not just that it was built, it is that it still works. Right now, as you listen to this, portions of the Cloaca Maxima are still connected to Rome's modern drainage system, still carrying rainwater from beneath the ancient Forum Romanum, still doing in a quiet and unglamorous way what they were built to do 2.5 millennia ago. That is the kind of fact that makes you set your phone down for a second and just sit with it. But the Cloaca was only one piece of Rome's sanitation architecture. To understand how Romans actually used the bathroom, how they experienced daily life around this question of waste, you need to walk a little further, into one of the Foricae. The Foricae were Rome's public toilets. The word comes from the Latin foris, meaning outside. These were facilities that existed outside the home, accessible to the general population scattered throughout the city in the same way we might find a public restroom today in a shopping district or a park. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, Foricae were a standard feature of Roman urban life. Many of them were funded not by the government, but by donations from wealthy citizens, a form of civic philanthropy that carried its own social currency. Building a public toilet was in ancient Rome a way of displaying your generosity to the city, which tells you something interesting about Roman values, doesn't it? To be seen funding a place where strangers relieved themselves was considered an act of civic virtue. Now here is where the picture gets complicated in ways that I find genuinely fascinating. Step inside one of these Foricae in your imagination, of course, and what you encounter is not what you might expect from a civilization celebrated for its sophistication. The room is long and relatively narrow. Stone benches line the walls, cut through at regular intervals with keyhole-shaped openings. These openings sit close together, closer than any modern person would find comfortable. There are no dividers between them, no partitions, no walls, no curtains. You sit knee to knee with whoever happens to be there that morning, a senator, a merchant, a soldier on leave, a freedman. And here is the thing about Roman public toilets that historians of the period come back to again and again. The Romans did not experience this as strange. For a culture that had grown up going to public baths, that conducted business in open-air forums, that watched public ceremonies in packed amphitheatres, the idea of private bodily functions simply was not a cultural priority in the way it is for us today. Privacy in ancient Rome was largely a luxury of the extremely wealthy. The concept of needing to be alone for one of the most fundamental acts of daily life was simply not part of the common Roman experience, but something else was present in those Foricae that I have been hinting at since the end of our last conversation, and now I have to tell you about it properly. Because this is the thing. This is the detail that when you hear it changes the way you think about Roman civilization forever. In front of each toilet seat, running along the floor in a shallow channel, fed by a constant flow of water from the city's aqueducts, there was a tool, a stick, roughly 30 to 45 centimeters long, with a sea sponge attached to one end. The Romans called it a xylospongium, or sometimes a tussorium, which translates in the most literal possible way as a wiping thing. This was the Roman equivalent of toilet paper. It was dampened in the water channel used for personal cleaning, rinsed in the channel, or in a bucket of salt water or vinegar and then left there for the next person. And that is the moment I want you to really sit with. Rome, the Rome of the aqueducts, the Rome of the marble temples and the 11 waterways bringing fresh water into the city, the Rome that Pliny called the greatest engineering civilization in history. That same Rome had its citizens sharing a single communal sponge in a room with no walls between the toilet seats. I am not saying this to mock them. They were working without the knowledge of germ theory, without any understanding of bacteria, viruses, or how pathogens move from person to person. They thought vinegar and salt water were sufficient to sanitize a shared implement, and in a world where nobody knew otherwise, that reasoning was perfectly logical. But here is what modern scientists studying ancient Roman latrines have found: parasite eggs, quite a lot of them. Archaeological studies of Roman latrine sediment, particularly from sites in Britain along Hadrian's Wall, and at Pompeii, have found evidence of intestinal parasites including whipworm and roundworm, at levels suggesting these were genuinely widespread health problems throughout the Roman population. One scholar studying the evidence put it this way: the Romans had extraordinary sanitation infrastructure, and yet showed no reduction in intestinal parasites compared to cultures with far simpler toilet arrangements. The xylospongium, far from protecting public health, may well have been one of the most efficient disease transmission devices in the ancient world. One shared sponge, dozens of users, no understanding of what was really passing between them. There is something almost poetic about that contradiction. And actually, if I am being honest, I think it says something important about the difference between infrastructure and knowledge. Rome built the infrastructure, the tunnels, the water supply, the public toilets. They invested enormous resources in moving waste away from people. But without the knowledge of why that mattered at the microscopic level, without germ theory, without any concept of contamination in the modern sense, they could not complete the picture. They were, in a sense, solving half of the problem with breathtaking precision and leaving the other half entirely untouched. And that is not a failure of intelligence. It is a reminder that knowledge and infrastructure have to develop together. One without the other only gets you part way. There is one more detail about the Foraker that I think deserves a moment of attention. The Romans, it turns out, were superstitious about their public toilets. Researchers excavating latrine sites across the empire from Rome itself to North Africa to the far reaches of Britain have found something unexpected scratched into the walls and sometimes inscribed on small tablets left inside incantations. Prayers, dedications to protective deities, Fortuna, goddess of luck, Cloacina, the goddess specifically associated with the Cloaca Maxima, whose name comes from the same Latin root as to cleanse. At a latrine site in Bath, England, archaeologists found a small curse tablet where a Roman had appealed to the goddess Sulis to punish whoever had stolen his woolen gloves from the bathroom. Someone took his gloves from a public toilet, and his response was to write a formal curse calling on divine justice to pursue the thief. I find that remarkable, not because it is strange, but because it is so recognizable. People used the bathroom, people behaved badly, and other people were outraged about it. Some things, it turns out, transcend millennia. Here is the other piece of the Roman picture that does not always make it into the popular imagination. The Foraker, for all their social openness, were designed primarily for those who could not afford better. The Roman wealthy had private toilets in their homes, the latrinae connected directly to the city's sewer network through underground pipes, with running water to flush waste away. These rooms were sometimes decorated with mosaics, tiled floors, even small frescoes on the walls. Going to the bathroom for the wealthy Roman was a private, even aesthetically considered experience. For everyone else, it was a public, communal, shoulder-to-shoulder affair in a dark stone room with one shared sponge on a stick. The same city, the same sewer system flowing beneath. Two entirely different realities separated by wealth. That is not a uniquely Roman problem, but Rome makes it visible in a way that is hard to look away from. I want to leave you with one image before we move forward. Somewhere in Rome today, not in a museum, not behind glass, but out in the open city near the Ponte Rotto bridge, where the Tiber curves through the old town, you can actually see the outfall of the Cloaca Maxima. The mouth of the tunnel where all those centuries of Roman waste and Roman water eventually met the river. It is not a grand monument. It does not draw crowds the way the Colosseum does. Most tourists walk right past it. But it has been there quietly opening into the same river since the days when Rome had kings instead of emperors. And I think there is something worth noticing about that. The things that keep a civilization alive, the unglamorous underground invisible things, are rarely the ones that get remembered. We remember the Colosseum. We forget the drain that made it possible to build it. Now, we're about to leave the grandeur of Rome, at least for a while, and step into a chapter of history that has one of the worst reputations for hygiene in all of recorded time. And yet, as we will discover, almost everything most people think they know about it turns out to be wrong. The Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the supposedly filthy, plague-ridden, bath-averse centuries between Rome's fall and the Renaissance. Here is a question to carry into the next part of our story. What if the image of the unwashed straw-covered medieval peasant was not history at all, but a story that a later era invented because it needed people to believe they had come so far? What if the dirt of the Middle Ages was in large part a myth? The answer is more surprising than you might think, and more than a little uncomfortable. Let me ask you something. When you picture a medieval person, not a knight in a movie, not a villain in a fantasy novel, but an ordinary medieval person, what do you smell? Be honest. For most of us, the answer comes almost without thinking. Something unwashed, something damp, hay and mud and old wool and the particular staleness of someone who's not been near water in a very long time. That image is so embedded in our cultural imagination that most people accept it without question. The unwashed Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, 1,000 years of Europe sitting in the dark, unable or unwilling to clean itself, waiting for the Renaissance to arrive and teach it how to take a bath. I want to spend some time with that image tonight. Not to admire it, but to take it apart piece by piece and show you how little of it is actually true. And then right at the end, I want to show you the twist. Because there is one. And it is genuinely unexpectedly strange. The term Dark Ages, the idea that Europe from roughly the 5th century to the 15th century was a kind of intellectual and cultural void, was not invented by historians who had studied the period carefully. It was invented in large part by people who came after it, and who needed to believe they had risen from something low. The concept has its very earliest roots in the work of Francesco Petrarca, known in English as Petrarch, an Italian poet and scholar writing in the 1300s, who looked back at the centuries after Rome's fall and described them as dark and ignorant compared to the light of classical antiquity. But that idea really gathered force much later. It was Enlightenment and Victorian writers, particularly historians writing in the 1800s, who crystallized the image of the medieval world as backward, filthy and superstitious. Why? Because they needed a before to thereafter. The Victorian era was a period of extraordinary self-confidence of railways and factories and empire and scientific progress. And to feel the full glow of that progress, it helped to have a past that looked as dark as possible. The scholar Tim O'Neill, who has spent years dismantling historical myths, makes this point clearly. The Dark Ages is a term that modern academic historians essentially abandoned decades ago, because the evidence simply does not support it. The medieval world was not a void. It was a different world with its own forms of learning art governance and, yes, hygiene. So what was hygiene actually like in medieval Europe? Let us start with something concrete. Paris, 13th century, a medieval city of somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people, which made it by the standards of the time one of the largest cities in the world. And by the late 1300s, Paris had over 32 public bathhouses operating within its walls. 32, in a city of that size that is not a luxury. That is infrastructure. Alexander Neckham, a scholar who lived in Paris around the 1200s, recorded something that has always charmed me a little. He wrote that in the mornings he would be woken by the sound of bathhouse attendants crying in the streets, announcing that the baths were ready and the water was hot, the equivalent of a medieval alarm clock. The bathhouse town crier. Hot water, come and get it. London at the same time had 18 hot bathhouses south of the Thames alone, in the neighbourhood called Suffolk. In some German and Dutch cities, going to the bathhouse was so normalised that it had become what historian Virginia Smith calls in her work on the history of cleanliness, something very close to what we would call going to a restaurant, a social outing, a community gathering, a place to eat and talk and be seen. German etchings from the 15th century show rows of people sitting in wooden bathtubs side by side, eating food, drinking wine, having conversations. There are beds visible in the background. The whole thing is, by modern standards, completely bewildering, but it is undeniably social, undeniably communal, and undeniably wet. These are not people who thought bathing was sinful. These are people who built bathhouses the same way later centuries would build coffee shops. The historian Carol Rawcliffe, who specialises in medieval public health, has made the point that medieval people were intensely aware of cleanliness, not always in ways that map neatly onto modern germ theory, but in ways that were deeply felt and socially enforced. In medieval towns across England, you could be fined for not visiting the public baths at least once a week. Fined. Compulsory bathing. That is not what a culture that does not care about cleanliness looks like. Medieval physicians working within the framework of Galenic medicine, which held that disease arose from imbalances in the body's four humours, often prescribed baths as treatment. Nightly bathing was recommended for the common cold. Herbal additives, rosemary, sage, chamomile were mixed into bath water for their medicinal properties. This is not the behaviour of people who think dirt is holy. A few religious figures did, notably some of the more extreme monastic orders, who associated physical discomfort with spiritual virtue. But historians who have studied the primary sources closely point out that these individuals were regarded even in their own time as eccentric. The exception, not the rule. So if medieval people were washing regularly, if Paris had 32 bathhouses and London had 18, then where did the myth of the filthy Middle Ages come from? The short answer is it was a story the Renaissance told about the era it had just left behind. And it was a story the Victorian age loved to repeat. But the part that genuinely surprised me when I first came across it is that the hygiene collapse scholars do find in the historical record happens not in the Middle Ages, it happens right at the end of them, in the 1500s, because of syphilis. The disease arrived in Europe with devastating speed in the late 1400s, its exact origin still debated, but its effects were immediate, widespread and terrifying. And because syphilis spread in part through close physical contact, and because public bathhouses were places where many people sat in close proximity, shared the same warm water, and sometimes, let us say, engaged in a range of activities beyond what the original architects had intended, the bathhouses became associated with the disease's spread. Fear did what fear does. People stopped going. Erasmus of Rotterdam, the great Dutch humanist philosopher writing in 1526, just 25 years after the disease had arrived, described what he saw with a kind of stunned dismay. He wrote essentially, 25 years ago, nothing was more fashionable in Brabant than the public baths. Today, there are none. The new plague has taught us to avoid them. 25 years. That is how quickly a centuries-old social institution can disappear when fear overtakes it. And the consequences were significant. Once the bathhouses closed, the custom of communal bathing did not simply move home. It largely faded. Household inventories from across the 16th and 17th centuries show bathing accessories, the tubs, the wooden wash bowls, the linen cloths gradually disappearing from even wealthy homes. Linen shirts became the replacement. The theory of the time held that linen worn against the skin would absorb sweat and impurity in the way water once had. Changing your linen was the new bathing. Clean linen equaled clean body. If you're raising an eyebrow right now, you should be. But the logic made sense to people who had no knowledge of how disease actually moved through bodies and water and shared space. So the genuinely filthy era, the centuries when bathing fell out of fashion across much of Europe, is not the Middle Ages. It is the Renaissance. The very era we hold up as a pinnacle of human achievement. Now, I want to come back to the toilets, because while all of this bathing history is playing out, people still need to use the bathroom. And in medieval Europe, the solutions range from genuinely clever to, frankly, terrifying. At the high end of medieval society in castles, monasteries, and wealthy urban households, there was the garderobe. The garderobe was a small room built into the thick exterior wall of a castle, projecting outward on stone supports called corbels. Sit in it and your waist fell down an open shaft through the wall and out the other side, hopefully into the moat or a river, or at least away from the inhabited parts of the castle. The engineering was more thoughtful than it sounds. Castle builders positioned these shafts carefully on the exterior walls so waste cleared the masonry. Some designs stacked multiple garderobes on different floors, all sharing the same shaft leading to a collection pit at the base. The name itself has a small irony baked into it. Garderobe literally means to guard the robes, and people really did hang valuable clothing near these rooms, because the sharp ammonia fumes rising up the shaft were believed to kill the moths and lice that plagued expensive fabric. Your medieval wardrobe smelled like a bathroom. Your bathroom functioned as a moth repellent. And somehow, this seemed like a perfectly reasonable arrangement to everyone involved. But the garderobe also had a darker side, a military one. Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, one of the most formidable castle fortresses of the medieval world, built by Richard I of England in the 1190s, was designed to be impregnable. Its walls were thick, its cliffside position almost impossible to assault directly. When King Philip II of France besieged it in 1203, his forces eventually found a way in. Not through the gates, not over the walls, through the garderobe shaft. A group of soldiers willing to endure what that particular route entailed crawled up through the waste chute, gained access to the castle's interior, and opened the gates from the inside. Chateau Gaillard fell to people who climbed the toilet. I genuinely do not know whether to file that under military strategy or human desperation, but it happened. And it is not the only recorded instance of a castle being compromised through its own latrine system. The garderobe designed to remove waste efficiently became in certain circumstances the weakest point in a fortress. For ordinary city dwellers, the situation was less architecturally dramatic, but no less practically challenging. In a 13th century city like London, most households used a cesspit, a lined pit below the ground connected to their private latrine upstairs. When full, these pits needed to be emptied. That job fell to a class of workers known as gong farmers. The name comes from the Old English gang, meaning to go, So a gong farmer was in the most literal sense someone who farmed the going. They worked at night, only at night by law, digging out the accumulated waste from cesspits across the city, loading it into carts and hauling it outside the city walls to be disposed of or sold as fertilizer. They were paid extremely well. Of course they were. No amount of money would have seemed like enough. By law, they were required to live in designated areas outside the main city. By social reality, they were among the most essential workers in the entire urban system. In 1409, the City of London recorded a case of 2 gong farmers who suffocated while working in a particularly deep cesspit. Carbon dioxide accumulation, most likely the trapped gases from weeks of decomposing waste. The record of their death sits quietly in a city archive, 2 names among the thousands of people who made medieval London function, by doing the work that no one else wanted to acknowledge. Here is what strikes me most looking at all of this. Medieval people were not indifferent to filth. They were not philosophically opposed to cleanliness. They built bathhouses and garderobes and cesspit systems, and employed entire professional guilds of gong farmers, because they cared deeply about managing waste. They just had different tools, different knowledge, and different constraints. The myth of the unwashed Middle Ages is in the end less a fact about the medieval world than it is a fact about the eras that came after it and what those eras needed the Middle Ages to have been. It is a reminder that history is not just what happened. It is also who got to describe it afterward, and that I think is worth sitting with tonight, because what comes next in our story is perhaps the most extreme example of that principle. A moment in history when one of the grandest, most celebrated buildings in human existence, a palace that would be photographed, painted, visited by millions, turned out to be concealing a secret so at odds with its gleaming facade that even the people who lived there could not entirely escape it. I am talking about Versailles, and I promise you, whatever you think you know about it, the reality is both worse and more fascinating. There is a particular kind of irony that history reserves for its most beautiful things. The buildings we photograph the most, the palaces we paint on porcelain and print on postcards, the places that make people travel thousands of miles just to stand in front of them and feel for a few quiet minutes that the world can be magnificent. Those places, it turns out, are also sometimes the ones with the most complicated stories hiding just beneath the gilded surface, and I cannot think of a more perfect example of that than the Palace of Versailles. Louis XIV moved his court to Versailles permanently in 1682. He was 43 years old at the height of his power, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades transforming what had been his father's modest hunting lodge into one of the most extraordinary buildings ever constructed by human hands. 700 rooms, 2,000 windows, 67 staircases, gardens stretching across 250 acres of perfectly manicured landscape, and between 3,000 and 10,000 people, courtiers, servants, diplomats, artists, guards, kitchen staff and tradespeople, living and working inside those walls on any given day. Somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people, in a building that at the time Louis took up residence had almost no functioning toilets. I want to sit with that number for a moment because I think it is where the story really begins. Not as a joke, not as a quirk of history to giggle at, but as a genuine, serious question. How do 10,000 people manage daily in a building without adequate facilities? The answer predictably is badly. Accounts from foreign ambassadors, court writers and visitors throughout the 17th and 18th centuries describe Versailles with a kind of stunned, horrified specificity. Madame de Sévigné, a noblewoman, and one of the great letter-writers of the era, whose correspondence gives us an extraordinary window into court life, wrote about the air and the smells of the court being enough to turn your stomach. Horace Walpole, the English writer who visited in the 1700s, complained that the smell hung over everything, and not just inside the palace. Even the famous gardens, he noted, were not free from it. A report from the Louvre Palace in Paris dated 1645, predating Versailles, but describing the same royal court culture put it in terms that leave nothing to the imagination. The grand staircases, it said, and behind the doors and almost everywhere one looks, one sees masses of waste and smells 1,000 unbearable stenches caused by people relieving themselves there every day, on the grand staircases. Now, the official history of Versailles, the one the palace itself will give you on a guided tour, tends to push back on the filthiest versions of this story. And there is truth in that pushback. The situation at Versailles was not quite as simple as 10,000 people, no toilets disaster. There were chamber pots in private chambers. There were a small number of latrines called lieux d'aisance, simple holes above cesspits, generally unventilated and badly maintained. There were over 30 cesspits built beneath the palace grounds, regularly emptied by servants in the night. Louis XIV himself, despite the legend that he bathed only twice in his life, a number that serious historians have questioned, did have a private bathing suite with 2 large tubs, one for soaping, one for rinsing. He changed his shirts multiple times a day. He wiped himself down with perfumed cloths and alcohol-based solutions. So the picture is not quite the catastrophe of total neglect. What it is, however, is the picture of a system that was hopelessly structurally overwhelmed from the very first day. The math simply did not work. Thousands of people, dozens of cesspits, a small number of dedicated latrines that regularly overflowed. A culture that, following the post-plague retreat from public bathing, had replaced water-based hygiene with layers of linen perfume and powder, and a king who had built his palace as a theatre, as a place where every act, including the most intimate ones, was part of a performance of power. Which brings me to the strangest detail in this entire story. At Versailles, going to the bathroom was a public event. Not for ordinary courtiers, for the king himself. Louis XIV regularly received visitors, held audiences, and conducted the business of running France while seated on what was called the chaise d'affaires, his commode chair. And the privilege of being present in the room during those moments of having access to the king, even in his most unguarded state, was one of the most sought-after honours a courtier could receive. To be admitted to the king's bathroom, to have an audience while he relieved himself, to have whispered a few words in his ear during that most private of moments. That was power. That was influence. That was what ambitious men at the court of the Sun King competed for. And this brings me to the English side of this story, because the French did not invent this particular dynamic. The English got there first, by a considerable margin. In the royal court of England, beginning sometime in the reign of Henry VII, so the very end of the 1400s, there existed an official position called the groom of the king's close stool. The close stool was a portable commode, a cushioned wooden seat fitted over a pewter pot often encased in velvet and studded with gilt, that served as the private toilet of the English monarch. And the groom of the close stool was the person responsible for attending the king during his use of it, supplying warm water, presenting the necessary linens, overseeing the entire process, and remaining throughout the most physically proximate person to the king in his most vulnerable moment. I want you to feel the full strangeness of this for a moment. Because by every instinct we have, this sounds like the worst job in the palace. Like the position you ended up in if you had offended someone important and needed to be gently humiliated. Except that is not what it was. At all. The historian David Starkey, one of the foremost scholars of Tudor court life, wrote about the groom of the stool with a phrase I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first encountered it. He said the groom had to our eyes the most menial of tasks, but his standing was the highest, and he meant it literally. Under Henry VIII, the great consuming, terrifying centre of Tudor England, the groom of the stool was among the most politically influential figures in the realm. Think about it from the inside. You had daily intimate, unguarded access to the king. You were present when no one else was allowed. You overheard things. You were trusted with things. The king in those private moments relaxed in ways he could not afford to relax in the full theatre of court. He spoke more honestly. He was more himself. And you were there. Every ambitious courtier in England knew it. Every minister, every duke, every bishop who needed something from the king, they cultivated the groom. They sent the groom gifts. They asked the groom for introductions, because a quiet word in the right moment at the right time, in the most private room in the palace, was worth more than a formal audience in the throne room. Several of Henry VIII's grooms were knighted. One of them, Hugh Dennis, who served Henry VII, rose to effectively manage the king's private finances, controlling the privy purse and becoming one of the most powerful administrative figures in the country. A man who was responsible for the king's toilet became in practice the keeper of the national treasury. Another groom, Sir Henry Norris, fell from grace during the political disaster surrounding Anne Boleyn in 1536. He was accused almost certainly falsely of adultery with the Queen, and was executed. His closeness to the king, which had been his great advantage, became the thing that made him a useful target when powerful people needed someone to blame. The same proximity that elevated you could destroy you. That is a lesson that applies well beyond Tudor England. If you think about it, the position lasted in various forms all the way until 1901, when King Edward VII, upon ascending the throne, quietly abolished it. 400 years. The most intimate position in the English royal court, surviving Tudor upheaval, Civil War restoration empire outlasting almost every other institution of the medieval monarchy. The last man to officially hold the title was James Hamilton, the second Duke of Abercorn, who served the then Prince of Wales in the late 1800s. He must have had, one imagines, a complicated relationship with the job description on his calling card. Back at Versailles, the situation had its own parallel. Under Louis XV, the Sun King's successor nobles actually paid for the right to attend the king at his commode. Paid for the privilege. The lever and crochet, the king's formal rising and retiring ceremonies, were already elaborate theatrical performances. But attending the king's most private moment remained throughout the 17th and 18th centuries a marker of genuine closeness to power, and Versailles became in that context not just a palace but a trap. Louis XIV had specifically designed the court structure to force powerful nobles to live at Versailles, permanently away from their estates, and their regional power bases dependent on royal favour for their status and income. To be at Versailles was to be visible, to leave was to be forgotten, and so thousands of nobles trapped by ambition and necessity lived in the gilded corridors of a building that could not adequately handle the consequences of housing that many human beings, and covered the gap with the most sophisticated system of scent and artifice the world had ever seen. The perfume industry of France, which still defines global luxury fragrance today, has its origins in no small part in this problem. Louis XIV commissioned his personal perfumer to create a new scent for every day of the week. He had his shirts changed up to 3 times daily, perfumed with a blend called Aqua Angeli, a complex mix of aloes, wood, nutmeg, storax, cloves and benzoin boiled in rosewater. Furniture was sprayed, wigs were powdered with scented mixtures, courtiers carried pomanders, small metal balls filled with aromatic herbs to hold under their noses when the corridors became unbearable. The French court became known across Europe as la cour parfumée, the perfumed court. And while that phrase sounds like an elegant compliment, it was in its original usage at least partly a description of a solution, the fragrant answer to a problem that had no other resolution. By 1715, the final year of Louis XIV's reign, the situation in the corridors had become significant enough that a royal decree was issued mandating that any waste found in the palace hallways be removed at least once a week. Once a week. If you need a weekly decree to ensure your palace's hallways are cleared of waste, things have not gone according to plan. The orange trees, the 2,000 crates of bitter orange trees that Louis kept in the Grand Orangerie designed by Jules Hardouin-Mansart, were not just a symbol of royal extravagance. They were, by the end of his reign, placed strategically throughout the palace to help mask the smells that no amount of perfume could entirely conquer. There is something I find genuinely moving about that image. 2,000 orange trees, moved through marble corridors on wheeled platforms by servants, their blossom scent which Louis had come to love above all other fragrances by the end of his life, floating through rooms where some of the most powerful decisions in 17th century European history had been made. He had built the most magnificent palace in the world, and at the end of it he was trying to make it smell like a garden. Not because he wanted luxury, because the alternative was unbearable. Here is what I keep coming back to when I think about Versailles. The palace was built to demonstrate that human will can overcome nature, that a king powerful enough can shape not just politics and war, but the physical world itself, making forests into gardens, swamps into marble floors, and raw power into something that looks from the outside like beauty. But nature in its most basic form kept insisting, every day, in every corridor, behind every curtain. No decree could fully contain it, no perfume could fully cover it, and not even the Sun King at the height of his glory could entirely solve the problem that every human being, regardless of their rank or their ambition, shares equally. The story of hygiene at Versailles is in the end the same story we've been tracing since the first pages of tonight's journey. It is the story of the gap between what human beings want to believe about themselves and what the physical reality of being human actually demands. And what comes next in our history is perhaps the moment when that gap finally began to close, not at Versailles, not in any palace, but in the least glamorous, most necessary way possible, through a crisis so catastrophic, so impossible to ignore, that an entire civilization was finally forced to look at what it had been doing and reckon seriously with the consequences. The Black Death changed what medieval people feared about cleanliness. But what happened in the centuries that followed the pandemics, the disease, the growing cities overflowing with waste, eventually produced a response so radical, so expensive, so politically charged, that it would take a parliament closing its doors and a river so foul it could strip paint to finally make it happen. That story begins in the swamps of medieval London, and it ends with one of the most important engineering projects in the history of public health. Aye, London. Summer of 1858. The city is the largest on earth, somewhere between 2.5 million people, packed into streets built for a fraction of that number. It is July, the kind of heat that makes brick walls radiate long after the sun has gone down, the kind of heat that has no relief. And then somewhere around mid-June something begins to change along the banks of the Thames. Not visually, not at first. It is something you would notice before you could explain it. Something that makes you slow your step, press your handkerchief to your face, and wonder for a brief disorienting moment whether something has gone deeply catastrophically wrong with the world you're standing in. And then you would understand. Because that summer the River Thames, the spine of the greatest city in the world, the artery of the British Empire, had become in the truest sense an open sewer. Not a metaphor. A literal simmering, putrefying sewer, heated by the worst summer temperatures in decades, baking 2 million people's worth of untreated waste on exposed riverbanks in the full English sun. The smell reached Parliament. Members of Parliament sitting in the new Houses of Parliament built right on the river's edge just a decade before held perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces and struggled to function. The curtains of the House of Commons were soaked in lime chloride, in a desperate attempt to keep the air breathable. When that failed proposal circulated to move the entire government to the countryside temporarily until the situation resolved itself. It did not resolve itself. History would call it the Great Stink of 1858. To understand how London got to that moment, you have to go back roughly 3 decades back to when cholera first arrived in England. The year was 1831. A disease that had devastated populations across India and Asia finally crossed into Europe, then Britain. Within a year, it had killed more than 30,000 people in England and Wales alone. Cholera is brutal in its speed. Severe diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration. It can kill an otherwise healthy adult within a matter of hours, and nobody understood why. The dominant medical theory of the time was called miasma theory. The idea was simple, intuitive, and completely wrong disease it was believed spread through foul-smelling air. Breathe the wrong air from a swamp, a rotting corpse, a pile of waste, and you would absorb the poison into your blood. By that logic, the solution to disease was to remove bad smells, and the solution the City of London applied, with the full authority of its Metropolitan Commission of Sewers in 1847, was devastating in its unintended consequences. They closed the cesspits, all 200,000 of them, and ordered that household drains be connected directly to the river. In one administrative stroke, every household in London began pumping its waste directly into the same water source that most of the city was also drinking from. The cholera epidemic that followed killed 14,137 people in 1849. Here is where one of the great figures of medical history enters the story. His name was John Snow. He was a physician living and practicing in Soho, then a crowded working-class district of central London, and he'd been thinking about cholera since the first outbreak of 1832. Snow had a different theory. Not miasma, not air, water. He believed, based on patterns he'd been tracking for years, that cholera was a disease that spread through contaminated water, specifically water that had been exposed to the waste of infected individuals. His peers largely rejected this. His publication of the theory in 1849 went almost entirely unread. The medical establishment found the idea implausible. After all, the same contaminated water seemed to affect some people and not others. Surely the air was a simpler, more consistent explanation. John Snow had to wait. His moment came in the autumn of 1854. On the 31st of August of that year, a severe outbreak of cholera began in Soho near Broad Street. In the first 10 days, more than 500 people died. Snow was already working. He went door to door through the neighbourhood, collecting the addresses of everyone who had fallen ill, mapping the cases on a paper grid of the local streets. And the map told a story that was, once you saw it, impossible to argue with. The deaths clustered around one point, a single water pump on Broad Street, now called Broadwick Street, where local residents had been filling their buckets and kettles for years. Snow also found 2 pieces of evidence that turned the map from compelling into proof. One, a widow in Hampstead, miles from Soho, had died of cholera during the outbreak. She had no connection to the neighbourhood, but her family confirmed she had specifically requested water from the Broad Street pump. She preferred its taste, and a bottle had been sent to her by a relative. She drank it. She died. 2 across the street from the pump stood a large brewery, the Lion Brewery on Broad Street. 70 workers employed there. Not one of them contracted cholera during the outbreak. Why? Because the brewery gave its workers a daily allowance of beer as part of their wages. Beer was brewed with boiled water and fermented liquids. Nobody at the brewery was drinking from the Broad Street pump. The contamination Snow later established had entered the well from a cracked sewer line less than a metre from the pump shaft. Snow presented his findings to the local authorities on the 7th of September. They removed the pump handle. The outbreak subsided almost immediately. It was one of the most elegant demonstrations in the history of epidemiology, the act of pulling a handle off a water pump to stop a disease that was killing hundreds of people. And yet Snow's peers still largely rejected his waterborne theory. He was accused in one particularly strange twist of institutional defensiveness, of being an enemy of sanitary reform, because by rejecting miasma, theory officials felt he was undermining the argument for cleaning up the air. Snow died in 1858, the same year as the Great Stink. He was 45 years old. He never received the full recognition his work deserved in his own lifetime, but something happened that summer, something even the most committed bureaucratic resistance could not easily deflect. Nature made the argument for him. With temperatures in London's shade averaging between 34 and 36 degrees Celsius through July and August of 1858, temperatures that today we would describe as extreme heat events. The waste that had been accumulating in the Thames for years reached a kind of critical mass. Dissolved oxygen in the river dropped to almost nothing. Fish disappeared. The water turned opaque. Charles Dickens, writing in the years just before the Great Stink, described the Thames as a deadly sewer in the place of a fine, fresh river. George Godwin, a social journalist, estimated that in some stretches the waste deposited on the riverbank was more than 6 feet deep. Michael Faraday, the great scientist, had conducted his own small famous experiment in July of 1855, dropping white pieces of paper card into the Thames from a wharf near London Bridge to test the river's clarity. The paper disappeared from view before it was even fully submerged. He wrote publicly about what he observed, describing the water as an opaque dark brown uniform in appearance throughout. By the summer of 1858, that dark brown river was also radiating heat and baking into what one account described as a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. Those were the words of Benjamin Disraeli, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The politician who had blocked and delayed sanitation reform for years was now writing poetry about how bad the river smelled. Parliament passed an Enabling Act that same summer. £3 million was allocated to the Metropolitan Board of Works to build a comprehensive modern sewer system for the city, and the man who would actually build it was a civil engineer named Joseph Basil Jett. If there is a quieter hero in the history of public health, a person who saved more lives than almost anyone in his century, but whose name fewer than 1 in 100 people today could probably recognise, I do not know who it is. Basil Jett had been working on sewer proposals since the early 1850s. He had submitted plans, he had argued cases, he had watched multiple predecessors fail to get funding, including one chief engineer who died of what records described as harassing fatigues and anxieties from the strain of trying to get the project approved. When the money finally arrived after the Great Stink, Basil Jett had been ready for years. What he built was extraordinary. 82 miles, 132 kilometres of main brick-lined intercepting sewers running beneath the streets and embankments of London, collecting waste from 1,100 miles of smaller street drains and carrying it eastward, downstream, away from the central city and its water intakes to holding tanks, and eventually to the tidal Thames far beyond the populated areas. The egg-shaped brick tunnels which Basil Jett specifically designed, wider than his calculations required because he said if there was any doubt they should build larger, were an engineering masterpiece. He personally approved every connection. The records of the Metropolitan Board of Works contain thousands of linen plans with handwritten notes from Basil Jett in Indian ink. Approved JWB. I do not like 6 inches used here. 9 inches should be used. JWB. A meticulous, exhausted, driven man crawling through his own plans, making sure that every pipe was right. This system began operation in 1865. Prince Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, formally opened the Abbey Mills pumping station, a building so ornate with such extraordinary cast-iron interior work that English heritage now classifies it as nationally important. A pumping station, a sewer pumping station, made beautiful. The Victorians, for all their contradictions, genuinely believed that even the most utilitarian infrastructure deserved dignity, and the results were swift. The last major cholera outbreak in London struck in 1866, 2 years before the full system was complete, and it killed 5,500 people, almost entirely in the East End of London, the one district that had not yet been connected to the new sewers. The areas served by Bazalgette's system were spared. It was the final proof, if any was still needed, that Snow had been right. Cholera has not killed a single person in London since. I want to sit with that for a moment. Because what Bazalgette built solved a problem correctly for the wrong reasons. Parliament funded the sewers to remove the bad-smelling air because they still believed in miasma theory. Bazalgette designed the sewers to intercept waste before it reached the drinking water, but he too was working partly within the miasma framework. And yet the result, by removing waste from the water supply, accomplished exactly what Snow had said needed to happen. The right solution arrived at through the wrong understanding. I find that genuinely astonishing, and a little bit humbling, because it suggests that sometimes, perhaps more often than we admit, progress happens not because we fully understand what we are doing, but because we finally do something, and the doing turns out to be right, even when the reasoning behind it is not. The historian who has perhaps written most perceptively about Bazalgette, Peter Ackroyd, described him as one of the greatest heroes in London's long history, not for any battle or political decision, but for what is now buried beneath the city. He saved more lives, Ackroyd argues, than any single Victorian military, political or medical. A monument to Bazalgette stands today on the Victoria Embankment, which he himself designed and built as part of the sewer project. The Latin inscription above it reads Flumini vincula posuit. He put the river in chains. The river that had killed tens of thousands of people now flows clear enough to sustain salmon and seahorses, both of which have been documented in the Thames in the past decade. From a baking cesspit of 2 million people's waste to a habitat for seahorses in about 150 years. What strikes me most about this whole story, the miasma debate Snow's rejected maps, the great stink Bazalgette building sewers for the wrong reasons that worked, is how much of the progress in human sanitation has happened sideways. Not because someone sat down, understood the problem completely and solved it, but because enough pressure accumulated, biological, political, olfactory, sometimes literally unbearable, that the system finally cracked and let something new through. That is not a comfortable pattern. It means that progress tends to come later than it should. It means people die in the gap between what we understand and what we act on. But it also means that catastrophe sometimes is not the end of a story. Sometimes it is the exact pressure a city needs to finally do the thing it should have done a generation earlier. And yet even with the sewers, even with Bazalgette's tunnels, even with cholera finally gone from London, there is a parallel story unfolding at the same time, one that is less about infrastructure and more about ideas. Because you can build the perfect sewer and still not understand why it works. The deeper revolution, the one that truly changed what human beings understood about cleanliness, about disease, about the invisible world of bacteria and contamination, that revolution was happening in laboratories while Bazalgette was still laying his bricks. And the men and women who drove it were facing their own version of the problem. Snow had faced brilliant, correct, and largely ignored by institutions that had too much invested in the old explanation to welcome a new one. That is where we're going next. Before we talk about laboratories and germ theory and the invisible world of bacteria before all of that, I want to go back briefly to a moment in the 14th century that almost everyone knows the name of, but whose effect on the history of hygiene almost nobody talks about: the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1352, bubonic plague swept through Europe with a ferocity that is still difficult to fully comprehend. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of the European population died. In some cities, Florence, Venice, Avignon, the death toll was closer to 60%. Bodies piled up faster than the living could bury them. Social structures collapsed. The church, which had promised to explain suffering, struggled for coherence. Entire villages simply stopped. And in the middle of this catastrophe, in the middle of watching a disease move through populations with no apparent logic, killing some people, and not others, spreading through cities in patterns that defied the medical understanding of the time, something remarkable began to happen. People started asking new questions. Here is the thing about catastrophe. Catastrophe does not always destroy knowledge. Sometimes it generates it. When Philippe VI of France asked the medical faculty at the University of Paris to explain who was most susceptible to the plague, the doctors gave an answer that was well-intentioned and completely wrong people who took hot baths. Because they explained heat, and water opened the skin's pores, and through those open pores the pestilential air could enter the body. Avoid baths, avoid heat, avoid anything that opens the skin. And as we explored earlier in our story, that answer shaped European attitudes toward water and bathing for the next 4 centuries. But here is the other thing that came out of the Black Death, the thing that often gets overlooked in favour of the bath avoidance story. The plague also paradoxically created the world's first systematic public health response. In Venice, one of the wealthiest and most internationally connected cities of the medieval world, city officials watched the plague arrive on ships from the east in 1347 and made a decision that was for its time extraordinary. They required incoming ships to anchor offshore for a waiting period before anyone was allowed to disembark. Initially 30 days, then 40. The Italian word for 40 is quaranta, and that waiting period, quarantino, entered the English language as quarantine, a word we still use today. Born from medieval Venice's attempt to slow a plague it did not understand but could observe. In Milan city, officials took even more extreme measures. Households in which plague was discovered were locked shut entirely, with the sick and the well alike sealed inside. Nobody entered or left until 40 days had passed. It was brutal. It was by modern standards inhumane. But Milan survived the Black Death with lower mortality rates than almost any other major city in Europe. Somehow, without germ theory, without bacteriology, without the microscope, these cities had stumbled onto a correct answer through observation alone. If you keep the sick away from the well, fewer people die. They could not explain why. They did not need to. The evidence was in front of them. And this is the pattern that runs through this entire chapter of hygiene history, the pattern I keep coming back to because I think it says something important, not just about the past, but about how human knowledge actually advances. It almost never moves in a clean, logical line from question to answer. It lurches, it stumbles into things, it arrives at correct conclusions through reasoning that is partly or entirely wrong. And then, and this is the harder part, it takes generations to convince people who have already made up their minds. Nobody in the history of this story exemplifies that pattern more tragically than a Hungarian physician named Ignác Semmelweis. It is 1846. Vienna General Hospital is one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the world, the training ground for European medicine's best minds, and in its maternity ward women are dying. Not at the rates you might expect from poor underserved communities. These were women in the care of trained physicians, the very best care that 19th century Europe could offer, and they were dying of a condition called puerperal fever, childbed fever, an infection that set in within days of delivery, causing acute abdominal pain, swelling fever, and in many cases rapid death. The hospital had 2 separate maternity wards. One was run by medical doctors and medical students. The other was run by midwives, and in the ward, run by doctors, the physicians, the trained medical men, the death rate from puerperal fever was in some months over 18%. In the ward run by midwives, the same fever killed less than 2%. Women knew it. They begged to be assigned to the midwife ward. They went into labour early on purpose to avoid being admitted to the doctor's ward. Some refused care altogether and delivered alone in the streets, and even then their survival rates were better than in the physician's clinic. The problem was that nobody could explain why. Ignaz Semmelweis arrived to take over the physician's ward in 1846 and was confronted with those numbers immediately. He was a meticulous observer, detail-oriented in the way that either makes a scientist great or drives their colleagues quietly insane. And he spent months looking for a pattern. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a moment of pure scientific insight. It was a death. His close friend and colleague Jakob Kolečka was accidentally stabbed with a student's scalpel during an autopsy in 1847. Kolečka died within days, and when Semmelweis examined the pathological findings, the specific tissue damage, the pattern of inflammation, they were identical to those of the women dying from puerperal fever. Kolečka had died from contact with cadaverous material. The women were dying from contact with cadaverous material, carried on the hands of the doctors who moved without washing, directly from the autopsy room to the delivery ward. The connection hit Semmelweis with the force of something obvious in retrospect, which, as anyone who has ever missed something obvious knows, is the most uncomfortable kind of revelation. He went to work immediately. He ordered all medical students and physicians in his ward to wash their hands with a chlorinated lime solution, specifically using the chlorine because it eliminated the smell of decay before examining any patient. The results were staggering. In May of 1847, before the new protocol, the death rate in his ward was 18.3%. By June, 2 weeks later, it had fallen to 2.2%. By July, 1.2%. By the end of the following year, the ward had entire months in which not a single mother died of puerperal fever. Not one. In a ward where the previous norm had been burying one in 5. You would think this would be cause for celebration. You would think that other doctors seeing those numbers would immediately adopt the protocol. What actually happened is one of the more distressing stories in the history of medicine. The medical establishment largely refused. Some colleagues were genuinely puzzled by the data and open to it, but many particularly senior physicians whose authority rested on their expertise rejected Semmelweis's conclusions with a hostility that feels from this distance almost personal. Because in a way it was. What Semmelweis was saying, what the data inescapably implied, was that doctors were killing their patients. That the men who had spent years training for a prestigious profession, who considered themselves among the most educated people in European society, had been walking from the autopsy room to the delivery room, carrying the instruments of death on their own hands. Gentlemen's hands cannot carry disease. That was more or less the objection. The idea that a physician could be a vector of infection, not a healer, but inadvertently an agent of death, was considered not just scientifically unlikely but morally offensive. Semmelweis spent the remaining years of his life trying to convince people who had decided they did not want to be convinced. He published, he lectured, He wrote increasingly desperate open letters to the international medical community, in which his language grew sharper and more impassioned, calling out colleagues by name for presiding over what he called a massacre. In one letter he wrote, "Thousands upon thousands of mothers and infants have perished, lives that could have been saved. The killing must end." His colleagues found the letters erratic. They used them as evidence that he was becoming unstable. In 1865, the same year that Louis Pasteur was finally validating germ theory, and Joseph Lister was beginning to develop antiseptic surgical techniques, Ignaz Semmelweis was committed to a mental institution in Vienna. He was 47 years old. He died there 2 weeks later. The cause of death was cruelly ironically an infection, almost certainly contracted from the asylum itself. He never knew that he was right. He never knew that within a decade of his death, the scientific community would accept germ theory, fully look back at his data, and recognize that what he had done in 1847 was nothing short of revolutionary. He never knew that hospitals across the world would eventually adopt hand-washing protocols as the single most effective intervention in preventing hospital-acquired infection, a status they still hold today. He never knew that his name would be attached to something called the Semmelweis effect, a psychological concept describing the tendency of people to reject new knowledge when it conflicts with established beliefs. The man who discovered how to stop women dying in childbirth had his own name turned into a word for why we refuse to believe things we find inconvenient. If that is not a fitting and terrible summary of a life spent fighting institutions, I do not know what is. Here is the question I want to leave with you for a moment, because I think it is the one that really matters. If the data was so clear, if the numbers showed month after month that hand-washing was saving lives, why did it take so long? The philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, writing in the 1960s, described what he called paradigm shifts, the idea that scientific communities do not simply adopt new evidence the way a computer updates its software. They resist. They reinterpret data to fit what they already believe. They marginalize the people who are asking the inconvenient questions, and then when enough evidence accumulates, when enough of the old guard has retired or died, the shift happens suddenly and completely, and everyone acts as if it was obvious all along. What was happening with Semmelweis was not a failure of logic. It was a failure of institutional courage, and it cost an uncountable number of lives in the years between his discovery and the moment when the rest of medicine finally caught up. The good news, and there is good news, is that once germ theory was established in the 1860s and 70s, the speed of progress in public health was genuinely extraordinary. Louis Pasteur, working in France, demonstrated conclusively in the early 1860s that microorganisms caused fermentation, putrefaction, and disease. Robert Koch, a German physician, took that work further, identifying the specific bacteria responsible for tuberculosis in 1882 and cholera in 1883. His work established the logical framework for understanding how pathogens cause specific diseases. Joseph Lister in Scotland, inspired by Pasteur's work, introduced antiseptic surgery in 1867, using carbolic acid to sterilize wounds instruments and the surgeon's hands. Surgical death rates, which had been catastrophically high, fell dramatically. And hand-washing, Semmelweis's specific, precise data-backed intervention, began to be adopted systematically in hospitals across Europe and North America in the 1870s and 1880s. But here is the thing I keep coming back to even after all the scientific triumph. Do you know when the World Health Organization first issued a formal global guideline on hand hygiene in healthcare settings? 2009. Not 1870, not 1920, 2009. 162 years after Semmelweis counted his numbers in Vienna and showed beyond any reasonable doubt that washing hands between patients saves lives, The Global Health Authority issued its first formal universal guideline on how to do it. I find that both astonishing and somehow not surprising at all, because the Semmelweis effect is not a relic of the 19th century. It is present in every era, in every institution, in every room where someone with data is standing in front of someone whose identity is invested in the old explanation. What makes this part of the story remarkable to me personally, quietly remarkable, is that the thing Semmelweis was asking for was so small. Not a new drug, not a surgical revolution, not an expensive technology or a political overhaul, just water and a handful of chlorinated lime. The simplest act of hygiene, the one that most of us perform without thinking several times a day, was for a critical window of medical history controversial enough to destroy a man. There is one more layer to this story, one more piece of the picture that germ theory and the late 19th century built that we need to pick up and carry forward. Because while Semmelweis was fighting his battles in Vienna, and Pasteur was peering at his cultures in Paris, and the great stink was finally forcing London to fix its sewers, something else was happening. Something quieter, and in its own way equally significant. In laboratories and in advertising offices alike, in chemistry and in commerce, the definition of clean was being reinvented. Not just for hospitals, for homes, for bodies, for the spaces between people. And the story of how soap and deodorant and the concept of personal hygiene were shaped as much by marketing as by medicine. How some of the things we consider basic daily necessity were in many cases invented not by doctors, but by people who wanted to sell you something. That story is next. And it is, I promise you, more surprising than you might expect. Something quietly extraordinary happens when a civilization finally figures out what is actually making people sick. It does not announce itself with a parade. There is no single day when everyone wakes up and understands. It seeps in. It moves through doctors' offices and newspaper columns and school curricula over the course of decades. And then somewhere in that gradual shift, in that long, slow transformation from the world of miasma and mystery to the world of germ theory and Louis Pasteur, something else happens. Something that has nothing to do with medicine at all. Something that has everything to do with selling things. By the early 20th century, germ theory was established. The understanding that invisible microorganisms cause disease, that bacteria move from surface to person, from hand to mouth, from water to gut, had fundamentally changed what educated people understood about illness. And into that new understanding, into that freshly opened space of public anxiety about invisible threats, walked an industry that understood something very well. A frightened consumer is a buying consumer. Let me tell you about a product called Listerine. Most of you have it somewhere in your bathroom, that small, aggressively medicinal bottle of amber liquid. You probably use it without thinking much about how it got there. Listerine was invented in 1879 by a chemist named Joseph Lawrence. He named it after Joseph Lister, the Scottish surgeon who pioneered antiseptic medicine, the same Lister whose work came directly from germ theory, whose carbolic acid-soaked operating rooms had transformed surgery from a near-death sentence into something that could reliably save lives. The naming was intentional. It borrowed Lister's scientific credibility for a product that was in its early life used for almost anything except what we now associate it with. In the 1880s, Listerine was sold as a surgical antiseptic, then as a floor cleaner, then as a treatment for gonorrhea, then, and I promise, I am not making this up, as a cure for dandruff when applied to the scalp. The company was essentially throwing darts at a wall and hoping something would stick. Nothing particularly did. In 1921, Listerine's annual revenue was around $100,000. A modest business, useful enough, not exactly a cultural phenomenon. And then something happened in a brainstorming session. that would turn Listerine into one of the most financially successful advertising stories in American history. Gerard Barnes Lambert, heir to the company, was sitting with his team trying to figure out what Listerine's main selling point should be. A chemist in the room mentioned almost in passing that Listerine was effective against something called halitosis, an obscure Latin-derived medical term. Halitus, breath. Osis, a medical condition. Halitosis. Lambert stopped the room. He asked the chemist to repeat it, and then, as he later wrote himself, he saw it immediately. Bad breath already existed. Human mouths had been producing unpleasant aromas since the beginning of human history. Ancient Egyptians had made breath-freshening tablets from boiled herbs and honey. People had always known about it, but nobody had given it a medical name. Nobody had framed it as a condition, not an embarrassment, not a personal quirk, but an ailment. Something that could be diagnosed. Something that required treatment. Lambert understood that the moment you give something a medical name, it stops being a social discomfort and becomes a problem with a solution. And he had the solution. The advertising campaign that followed was by any measure masterful. Not in a feel-good way. In the way that makes you slightly uncomfortable when you realize how precisely it understood human psychology. The ads featured characters, always a young woman, always one detail wrong. She was lovely, she was intelligent, she was kind, but she had chronic halitosis, and because of it she was lonely. Her colleagues avoided her. The man she wanted didn't call. One ad asked simply, "Can I be happy with him in spite of that?" The genius of the campaign was not the product, it was the anxiety it manufactured, because before 1923 most Americans did not think of bad breath as a social catastrophe. It was unpleasant, yes. It happened, yes. But it was not something you checked for every morning with the acute dread that these advertisements suggested you should. Listerine did not cure bad breath so much as it invented the fear of it. Within 7 years of the halitosis campaign, the company's annual revenues had risen from $100,000 to more than $8 million in 7 years, from floor cleaner to cultural necessity. The advertising scholar James Twitchell put it best: Listerine did not make mouthwash as much as it made halitosis. Now let me ask you something. When did you last check your breath before talking to someone? Was that a habit you had your whole life? Or is it something that developed, something that came from somewhere, some message absorbed so thoroughly that it no longer feels like a message at all? Because this is what I find genuinely fascinating about this era. Germ theory was real. The invisible world of bacteria was real. The idea that cleanliness had health consequences was real and true and important. But the companies selling cleanliness products quickly learned that scientific truth is not the same as commercial anxiety, and that you could use one to manufacture the other. Around the same time that Listerine was reshaping America's relationship with its mouth, another product was doing something similar with a different body part. In 1912, a young woman named Edna Murphy was struggling to sell an antiperspirant that her father, a Cincinnati surgeon, had invented to keep his hands dry during operations. She tried selling it at conventions. She went door to door. She convinced drugstore owners to stock it. Nothing worked. In the early 1900s, most Americans dealt with perspiration the way they always had with washing, with dress shields sewn into clothing at the armpits, with perfume applied liberally. Body odour was considered unpleasant, but it was not considered exactly shameful. It was the natural consequence of being warm-blooded. What Edna did next changed that. She hired an advertising firm, the J. Walter Thompson Company, one of the most prestigious in New York, and gave them an almost impossible brief: convince American women that a problem they had been managing for centuries without specialized products now required a specialized product. The copywriter assigned to the account was James Webb Young, who would later become one of the most celebrated advertising minds of the century. He wrote a campaign for Edna's product now called Odorono, as in Odor O No, that appeared in Ladies' Home Journal in 1919. The ad was direct in a way that American advertising had almost never been before. It addressed sweat by name in a women's magazine. Young later said that hundreds of women cancelled their subscriptions to the magazine in outrage at the advertisement. They found it vulgar, inappropriate, an insult to the dignity of women to suggest their bodies produced an offensive smell. Sales increased by 112%. The women who cancelled their subscriptions were in a sense completely right. There was something invasive about what was happening, something calculated. Before Odorono, before the campaign that followed, before the deodorant and antiperspirant industry grew into the $18 billion global enterprise. It is today most people managed fine. Not comfortably, perhaps, not in every social situation, but the acute, almost phobic relationship that modern Western consumers have with the idea of any natural body odour, that specific anxiety that carefully maintained fear, was not a natural development. It was manufactured, carefully, deliberately, effectively. Now I need to tell you about Lifebuoy. In 1933, the Lever Brothers Soap Company, which had been selling Lifebuoy since 1895, launched an advertising campaign that introduced two letters into the American vocabulary that have never left. B.O. Body odour. Lifebuoy's radio advertisements played a low foghorn-like sound, a mournful judging tone every time a character in the spot was secretly identified as having body odour. The ads ran constantly. The foghorn became so recognisable that Warner Brothers later parodied it in cartoons. And with it came a new social terror, not just that you might be perspiring, but that you might be perspiring without knowing it, that other people could smell you before you could smell yourself, that you were walking through life trailing an invisible offence that polite society would never tell you about. The historian and writer Bill Bryson, whose research on this period is wonderful, described these campaigns as essentially creating a new category of anxiety out of things that had been simply part of daily existence for all of human history. And Lysol, which had begun its life in 1889 as a German disinfectant used to help contain a cholera outbreak, went perhaps the furthest of all. In the 1920s and 30s, Lysol was marketed to American women as a feminine hygiene product. The advertisements suggested in language as euphemistic and indirect, as the law required that women who used Lysol would preserve marital harmony and protect themselves from the deterioration that apparently threatened every marriage. The historian Andrea Tone, in her research on contraceptives in America, documents what these ads were really selling: a product positioned to function as a contraceptive douche in a country where direct contraceptive advertising was illegal under the Comstock Act. By 1940, douching was the most common form of birth control in America. The leading product was Lysol, a disinfectant, with a failure rate above 50%. That caused documented burns and injuries. That killed at least 5 women before the formula was eventually changed in 1952. The Hygiene being sold was not about health. It was about control. Control of women's bodies framed as cleanliness. Control of a new consumer market framed as a medical necessity. I want to be clear about something. None of this means that soap, deodorant, or mouthwash are bad things. Germ theory is correct. Hand washing saves lives. Personal hygiene genuinely matters for public health. But what happened in the early 20th century in those advertising offices and magazine spreads and radio scripts was something more complicated than simply spreading good information. It was the moment when the legitimate science of cleanliness was systematically harnessed to manufacture personal shame. The fear that your mouth might offend, the fear that your body might repel, The fear that your natural human physicality left unmedicated and undeodorized and unscented was fundamentally unacceptable. These fears were not discoveries, they were inventions, and they have shaped the personal hygiene industry, now worth hundreds of billions of dollars globally from that moment to this one. Here is the part that I find most interesting and most honest. Most of us know on some level that advertising shapes our behavior. We consider ourselves fairly sophisticated about it. We know that brands manipulate our emotions, and yet the hygiene anxieties planted in the 1920s and 30s still operate in us today, largely unchallenged, taken as simple biological common sense assumed to be natural rather than engineered. The morning shower that feels not just pleasant but morally necessary. The mild social discomfort at the idea of going a day without deodorant. The vague sense that a body that smells like a body is a body that has failed at something. None of that comes from nowhere. There is a final dimension to this story, one that speaks directly to where the history of hygiene has always led us. Through every era we have visited tonight, from the private bathrooms of Mohenjodaro to the Roman forêt from the medieval bathhouses of Paris, to the perfumed corridors of Versailles from Jon Snow's map to Bazalgette's tunnels to Semmelweis's data. The question of who gets to be clean and who gets to decide what clean means has never been purely about health. It has always been about belonging, about who fits into the social body, about who is worth the infrastructure, the technology, the cultural attention. In the 20th century, that question was answered increasingly by commerce, and as we move into the final chapters of tonight's journey into the flush toilet's actual invention and disputed history into the moment, the modern bathroom finally became a standard. Into the billions of people today who still live without what we take for granted, that question gets harder, not easier. The flush toilet, as it turns out, has a history full of myths, including a man whose name has been used as a synonym for the very thing he supposedly created, despite the fact that he didn't create it. The real story of who invented what when it was accepted and why it took so long to spread, even after the technology clearly existed, that story is waiting just ahead. There is a name in the history of toilets that almost everyone thinks they know. Thomas Crapper, sanitary engineer, Victorian plumber, inventor of well-you-know. His very name has entered common usage as a word for the thing he supposedly created. Crapper, as synonymous with toilet. The story writes itself right. A man literally named for the thing he invented. History is rarely that tidy. And the story of the flush toilet is one of the most consistently misattributed in all of popular history. A tangle of real inventors' forgotten names, wildly useful innovations, and a single plumber whose reputation was inflated to mythological proportions by a satirical book that many readers took entirely at face value. Let me try to set the record straight, because the actual history is in several ways far more interesting. Wind back to the year 1596, England under Queen Elizabeth I. At a house near Bath called Kelston Manor, a man named Sir John Harrington. The Queen's godson is sitting down with paper and pen to write a pamphlet. Not a serious pamphlet, a satirical one. Its full title, as published in 1596, is A New Discourse of a Stale Subject Called the Metamorphosis of Ajax. Ajax was an Elizabethan pun. A jakes was slang for a toilet. The title then was essentially a literary joke, a new essay about the old problem of sewage dressed up in mock-heroic Latin terminology. Harrington was that kind of writer, witty, irreverent, clever enough to get away with things that would have gotten other men into trouble precisely because his godmother was the Queen. But buried inside his satirical pamphlet was something entirely genuine, a detailed technical description of a flushing toilet that he had actually built. The The design used a raised cistern, a tank of water positioned above the bowl connected to a valve that, when pulled, released approximately 7.5 gallons of water downward through a pipe flushing waste from the bowl into a cesspit below. It was functional. Harrington installed one at his home. He installed a second at Richmond Palace for the Queen herself. Elizabeth I reportedly used it. She reportedly complained it was too loud. The Queen's verdict on the world's first flush toilet: it was noisy. Harrington's invention did not catch on. And this is where the story gets interesting, because the reason had nothing to do with the technology. The technology worked. The problem was that the technology existed in isolation, without a pressurized water supply to fill the cistern continuously, without sewers to carry the flushed waste away, without the urban infrastructure that would make individual household plumbing anything more than an expensive novelty. Harrington's toilet was the right answer to a question that the rest of the city had not yet asked. A flush toilet without sewers is a beautiful solution to only half of a problem. He published his pamphlet, built his 2 toilets, and then the world went back to chamber pots and cesspits for another 180 years. The next significant chapter belongs not to a courtier or a plumber, but to a watchmaker, Alexander Cumming, born in Edinburgh in 1733. A man of remarkable precision, appropriate for someone who made instruments that measured and tracked the movements of the world, who turned his attention in 1775 to a problem that had been sitting unsolved since Harrington's day. The problem was this: even when a toilet flushed, the pipe connecting the bowl to the drain below was open, which meant that the gases from the sewer, sulfur, methane, the combined chemistry of everything going in below, could travel freely back up the pipe and into the room. Harrington's toilet was functional, but it smelled. Cumming's solution was elegant in its simplicity. He bent the waste pipe into an S shape, just an S bend. Gravity pulled water to the lowest point of the curve where it sat, permanently sealing the pipe. A water lock. A plug of water that blocked the passage of gases from below without preventing the flow of waste when flushed. He patented this design in 1775, the first official patent for a flush toilet in Britain. The S-bend, later evolved into the U-bend we still use today, was in its quiet and unglamorous way one of the most important inventions in the history of domestic hygiene. It made living near a toilet bearable, and by extension it made living in a house with a toilet conceivable. But even Cumming's invention could not immediately transform daily life, because again the infrastructure was not there. Sewers were rare and unreliable. Water supply was neither pressurized nor universal. For most people, even relatively comfortable middle-class families, an indoor flush toilet remained an expensive curiosity that required both the water and the drainage systems to be in place before it could function. Which brings us to a moment I find genuinely delightful in the history of sanitation. The year is 1851. The location is the Crystal Palace, the enormous, breathtaking glass and iron structure built in Hyde Park for the Great Exhibition, the world's first international trade fair organised under the vision of Prince Albert. 6 million people will pass through it over 6 months. And somewhere inside its gleaming interior, a sanitary engineer named George Jennings installed something that the vast majority of those 6 million people had never encountered in their lives: a public flushing toilet. The organisers were not initially enthusiastic about including public toilets in the exhibition. Someone reportedly said, and this quote has a particular quality that I love: "Visitors are not coming to the exhibition merely to wash." George Jennings, to his lasting credit, disagreed. He installed his monkey closets, as he called them, in the retiring rooms of the Crystal Palace. For the price of 1 penny a visitor received a clean toilet seat, a fresh towel, a comb, and a shoe shine. That penny and that transaction gave the English language a phrase it still uses to spend a penny: a euphemism for using the toilet that persisted for well over a century and which many people still recognize today. Over the 6 months of the Great Exhibition, 827,280 people paid that penny. 827,000 people queued to experience a flushing toilet because most of them had never seen one before. The technology had existed in various forms for 250 years, and the majority of the population of the largest city in the world had still never used it. Here is what I keep turning over in my mind about that number. 800,000 people in London in 1851. London, which had the Great Stink coming in 7 years. London, which already had the Versailles sewer project being debated. London, which had the cholera epidemics behind it and ahead of it. And still a flush toilet was extraordinary enough that people paid a penny and queued for the experience. The technology of cleanliness has never been equally distributed, and the Crystal Palace moment was the beginning of a shift not just in infrastructure but in expectation. Because once 800,000 working-class Londoners had experienced what a flush toilet felt like, the political pressure to make that technology universal became significantly harder to ignore. Now Thomas Crapper. The man himself was real. Born in Yorkshire around 1836, he moved to London as a young teenager, apprenticed as a plumber, and over the following decades built a genuinely successful business as a sanitary engineer and manufacturer of plumbing fixtures. His firm, Thomas Crapper and Company, held royal warrants serving Buckingham Palace and Sandringham Estate. He held 9 patents for plumbing innovations. He made real improvements to the ballcock, the floating valve inside the toilet cistern that prevents tanks from overflowing. Thomas Crapper was by any measure a skilled tradesman who made a real contribution to the refinement and popularization of indoor plumbing. What he did not do was invent the flush toilet. By the time Crapper was working in the 1860s, the flush toilet was already several generations old. The S-Bend was 90 years old. The Great Exhibition had already introduced it to hundreds of thousands of people. But Crapper did one thing that the genuine inventors before him had not quite managed. He understood marketing. His shop on the King's Road in London was one of the first retail spaces to actually display bathroom fixtures in public toilets and basins and cisterns set up as if in a real bathroom visible from the street, available for anyone to walk in and examine. In Victorian England, displaying a toilet in a shop window was considered somewhere between eccentric and scandalous. People were not supposed to acknowledge in polite public space that such things existed. Crapper put them in the window. The man brought the toilet out of the closet in the most literal sense. And then, decades after his death in 1910, a writer named Wallace Rayburn published a book in 1969 called Flushed with Pride, The Story of Thomas Crapper. The book was satirical. It was written in the mode of mock-heroic biography, inflating Crapper's role in toilet history to obviously comedic proportions. But many readers took it seriously. And from that point, the myth metastasized Thomas Crapper, inventor of the toilet. His name, the origin of a particular word. Neither is true. The word crap, incidentally, comes from a medieval Latin term crappa, meaning chaff or waste. It predates Thomas Crapper by centuries. His surname was unfortunate in its timing, not its origin. I find the whole Crapper story quietly fascinating, not because of what it says about Crapper, but because of what it says about how we remember history. The people who actually made the critical innovations Harrington, who built the first working flush toilet in 1596, Cumming, who solved the sewer gas problem in 1775, Jennings, who introduced the toilet to hundreds of thousands of ordinary people. In 1851, these names are almost unknown. Thomas Crapper, who improved one component and put his name on a shop window, is what most people would cite if you asked them who invented the toilet. It is a pattern we have seen throughout this entire journey tonight. The people who actually move the needle, Semmelweis, Snow, Bazalgette, Cumming, are rarely the ones whose names enter common usage. History has a strange preference for the vivid over the accurate. By the end of the 19th century, something genuinely new was emerging. For the first time in human history, the idea that every household should have a dedicated bathroom, a room with a toilet, a sink and a bathtub, was beginning to transition from luxury to standard. Not everywhere, not all at once, not with anything like equity across class lines, but the direction was set. By the 1880s, most upper-class homes in Britain and the United States had a room specifically designated for washing and toilet use. By the turn of the century, it was making its way into middle-class homes. Doctors and architects began to collaborate on the idea as sanitation reform took hold that all the pipes and fixtures should be gathered into one room for practical and hygienic reasons. The bathroom, as a unified concept with toilet, sink and bath together, was essentially a creation of the 1890s. Before that, many homes had the bathtub in one room and the toilet in another, sometimes on a different floor, sometimes in an outbuilding entirely. The recognition that these things belonged together and that every family deserved access to both was still a contested idea in 1900. Do you know what percentage of American homes had an indoor toilet by 1960? 83%. Which means that as recently as 1960, just over 60 years ago, nearly 1 in 5 American homes had no indoor toilet. And these were not remote rural households. Some were in cities. Some were in neighborhoods that everyone knew. The shift from something wealthy people have to something that is considered a basic right for all happened within living memory of people still alive today. And the final piece of this history, the piece that brings us most directly into the present, is the 3 billion people who still don't have access to what we've spent this entire journey discussing. 3 billion. Not ancient history. Right now. On this planet. Tonight. The sanitation gap between what is technologically possible and what is universally available is not fundamentally different in kind from what it was in ancient Rome or medieval London or the Paris of Louis XIV. The knowledge exists. The technology exists. The gap is not a technical problem. It is a problem of will, of priority, of the same question that has run beneath every single chapter of this story: who is considered worth the investment? That question leads us directly into the final chapters of tonight's journey. Because sanitation in the 21st century is not just about toilets and sewers, it is about what the future of cleanliness looks like: the $23 million space toilet, the bidet's unexpected revival in the American home, the new generation of waterless and composting systems designed for a planet that cannot afford to waste as much water as we currently do. And beneath all of that, always underneath everything, the 2.5 billion people who are waiting for something the rest of us do not even think about as we reach for the handle on our way to bed tonight. Right now, as you settle in under whatever covers are keeping you warm tonight, someone somewhere on this planet is walking through the dark. Not because they want to, not for exercise or fresh air or a quiet moment with their thoughts. They are walking because their home has no toilet, and they need to find somewhere safe, somewhere private enough, somewhere far enough from the water supply to do something that every single human being on Earth does multiple times every day. 3.4 billion people. That is the current estimate from the World Health Organization and the United Nations. 3.4 billion people on this planet. Roughly 43% of the global population still do not have access to safely managed sanitation. And of those 354 million still practice what researchers and public health officials call open defecation, which means exactly what the term implies. No facility at all. Fields, bushes, riverbeds, the same rivers that downstream villages may drink from. I want to hold that number for a moment before we go anywhere else. because this is one of those facts that is staggering in the abstract and easy to forget in the particular. We have spent the past several hours of this journey moving through thousands of years of human history, through Roman sewers and medieval bathhouses, through the great Stink and Semmelweis's data, through the Crystal Palace and Thomas Crapper's showroom. And the story we've been telling has, in its broad arc, felt like a story of progress, of getting better, of civilization slowly and unevenly, and sometimes for the wrong reasons, moving toward cleaner, healthier, more equitable arrangements. But the present-day number 3.4 billion should make us pause, because that number is not ancient history, it is not medieval, it is not Victorian, it is a number from a report published in the year in which you're listening to this, and it sits alongside this other fact which I find equally confronting. According to the World Health Organization, unsafe sanitation is responsible for approximately 564,000 deaths per year, largely from diarrheal disease. More than 700 children under the age of 5 die every single day from conditions linked to contaminated water and inadequate sanitation. Every day. 700 children, from something that the technology to prevent has existed in various forms since the Indus Valley civilization built private bathrooms into every household in Mohenjodaro 4,500 years ago. The gap between what is possible and what is universal is not a technical gap. This is worth saying directly without hedging. We know how to build toilets, we know how to build sewers, we know how to treat wastewater. We know how to provide clean water. The infrastructure that would close this gap is not mysterious or experimental. It is expensive, yes. It requires sustained political will. It requires governments to prioritize it. But it is not beyond human capability. The World Bank estimated that closing the global sanitation gap would require capital investment of at least $46 billion United States dollars per year in urban areas alone. $46 billion sounds enormous, until you consider that the United States alone spends approximately $850 billion per year on its military. The technology is not the barrier, the will is. Which brings us somewhat inevitably to the other end of the spending spectrum. Because while 3.4 billion people live without safe sanitation, NASA spent $23 million developing a single toilet for 2 units, $11.5 million each. The Universal Waste Management System, a name that NASA engineers apparently gave with full seriousness, though I confess it sounds like a corporate euphemism from a very specific department, was delivered to the International Space Station in the autumn of 2020. And I say this not to mock the endeavour, because the engineering challenges of managing human waste in zero gravity are genuinely extraordinary. In space there is no down. There is no gravity to pull waste away from the body. Every function that relies on gravity on Earth has to be replicated in some form by mechanical suction. The space toilet works by airflow. The moment the lid is lifted, a vacuum system begins pulling air, and with it anything else, away from the user and into the appropriate collection chambers. Solid waste goes into compressible bags. Liquid waste is collected, sterilized and recycled is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Astronaut Jessica Meir, who served on the International Space Station, described it publicly with what I can only describe as exemplary cheerfulness. We recycle about 90% of all water-based liquids on the space station, she said, including urine and sweat. When it comes to our urine on the International Space Station, today's coffee is tomorrow's coffee. I respect that commitment to the mission. I also appreciate that she said it out loud. The $23 million space toilet was actually a redesign driven in significant part by the experiences of female astronauts. Earlier space toilet designs had been built essentially for male anatomy. The funnels and suction mechanisms were shaped around a male body, and female crew members had been working around those limitations for decades of complaints filed through proper channels, decades of feedback politely submitted and sometimes politely ignored. The $23 million redesign included new funnel geometry, new positioning between the funnel and the seat, new ergonomic features, specifically developed from direct input of female crew members. It was a significant improvement, and it also illustrates in a somewhat pointed way a theme that has run through this entire story: who gets considered and who gets designed for when infrastructure is built shapes whether that infrastructure works for everyone or only for the people who are assumed by default to be the user. This pattern appears in the Roman foraker that the wealthy avoided. It appears in the Victorian bathrooms that reached the upper class first. It appears in the post-World War II housing developments where indoor plumbing arrived in white neighbourhoods before black ones. And it appears in a space toilet that spent decades working poorly for anyone who wasn't built like the engineers who designed it. Now let us come back to Earth, quite literally. Because on the surface of this planet, something is happening with hygiene that is genuinely interesting and has not received nearly enough attention. The bidet is making a comeback. For decades, particularly in the United States, the bidet was considered a European eccentricity, something you encountered in French hotels and Japanese airports and raised an eyebrow at before reaching for the toilet paper. The American relationship with bidets has historically been one of cheerful, slightly baffled indifference. And then in the spring of 2020, the toilet paper shelves went empty. The panic buying that accompanied the beginning of the global pandemic, whatever its psychological mechanisms, stripped store shelves of toilet paper across North America with a speed that genuinely surprised supply chain specialists. And in that strange, slightly chaotic moment, a significant number of Americans had their first real conversation about what bidets actually were and why the rest of the world had been using them for centuries. Bidet sales increased by more than 260% in the United States in the first months of 2020. A product that has been a niche purchase became temporarily the most visible alternative to an item that had suddenly disappeared from stores. Here is the interesting part. Of all the features of modern bathroom technology, the bidet is arguably the oldest and most globally established. The earliest bidets appeared in France in the 1600s, not long after Harrington's flush toilet as wash basins kept in bedrooms alongside chamber pots. The word itself comes from the French for a small horse, presumably, because the posture required to use one resembled riding. By the 18th century, bidets were standard furniture in French aristocratic homes. Marie Antoinette owned an elaborate one. Napoleon reportedly used one regularly, while European cultures and eventually Japanese culture, where the technology was perfected into the heated seat self-warming music-playing marvel of the modern washlet, embraced water as a cleansing agent for personal hygiene, America went firmly and comprehensively in the toilet paper direction. Part of this was marketing, as we have discussed. Part was plumbing standards. American bathrooms were not typically designed to accommodate bidets. Part was simply cultural momentum. Once a habit is established at scale, it becomes very difficult to dislodge. The COVID-19 toilet paper moment was not enough to fully change that momentum, but it planted a seed. Bidet attachment sales in the United States have remained significantly higher than pre-pandemic levels, years after the initial shortage resolved. A small but real shift, the kind that if it continues might actually look significant in another decade. And beyond bidets, something more fundamental is shifting in how engineers and policymakers think about sanitation's future. The conventional sanitation model, flush toilet connected to sewer, connected to treatment plant, is extraordinarily water-intensive. A standard toilet flush uses somewhere between 6 and 13 litres of water. A person using the toilet 5 times a day every day is consuming 30 to 65 litres of water purely for flushing. In a world where water scarcity is one of the most pressing issues of the 21st century, that volume is increasingly difficult to defend. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars funding what they call the Reinvent the Toilet Challenge, a global competition to develop toilet technology that does not rely on running water, does not require connection to a sewer, and is self-contained enough to be deployed anywhere on Earth. Several promising designs have emerged. Some use high-temperature combustion to sterilize waste. Some use biological processes to convert it into compost. Some are container-based systems designed for dense urban informal settlements, where building conventional sewer infrastructure is impractical. None of them are fully scaled yet. None of them have reached the 3.4 billion people who need them. But the work is happening, and the fact that it is happening, that some of the world's brightest engineers are sitting in laboratories thinking seriously about how to design a better toilet for people who have never had one, represents a shift in priorities that would have seemed unusual, even eccentric a generation ago. There is one more statistic I want to leave with you before we step back and look at the full arc of what we have covered tonight. Of the 37 million people who live in urban informal settlements, the slums, the favelas, the shanty towns, the informal housing developments that surround virtually every major city in the developing world, the vast majority have no access to sanitation infrastructure. Nairobi's Kibera settlement, one of the largest informal urban communities in Africa, has a sewer system designed for 800,000 people. The actual population exceeds 4 million. 80% of households in Kibera have no access to a sewer line. In a city that is by all other measures a functioning, modern, internationally connected capital city, there are people managing their basic bodily needs in conditions not meaningfully different from what a peasant in medieval London faced. Different technology, same structural gap. Who is considered worth the infrastructure? I keep coming back to that question. It is the thread that has run through this entire story from the first part to this one. Ancient Rome built magnificent public toilets for the poor so the wealthy would not have to see them. Medieval cities fined people for not visiting bathhouses but had gong farmers working in cesspits without protection. Victorian London built Bazalgette's sewers after the smell became too great for Parliament. Versailles covered the smell of 10,000 people with perfume and let the decree handle the weekly clearing of the corridors. Every era has found the same solution: build for the people whose discomfort matters most, and manage the rest however seems convenient. The question of our era is whether we're going to do something different. And I want to end this chapter of the story with something that is genuinely hopeful. Because the arc of sanitation history, for all its stops and reversals, does bend. Between 1990 and 2024, more than 2.1 billion people gained access to improved sanitation. That is 2.1 billion people for whom the walk in the dark is no longer necessary. 2.1 billion people with access to something that protects their health, their dignity, their ability to attend school, to work, to live without the grinding, constant, invisible cost of managing this most basic need in the open. That progress is real. It is significant. It is the largest expansion of sanitation access in human history, and it is not enough. Not yet. The story of hygiene and sanitation, from the first pit toilets of Mesopotamia to the $23 million vacuum systems floating above the earth, is not a story of continuous triumph. It is a story of recurring choices, of which problems get solved and which get managed, of which bodies are considered worth designing for, of which communities receive the infrastructure that keeps them alive, and it is in the end a story that has not finished yet. As we move toward the last 2 chapters of our journey tonight, I want to look back at everything we have covered, at the myths we have debunked, and the histories we have uncovered, and try to find the thread that holds all of it together. Because there is one, and it is not what I expected it to be when I first started thinking about this story. The thread is not technology, it is not science, it is not politics, though. All of those things play a role. The thread is something simpler and stranger and more persistent. It is the question of who we decide to see. The question I ended with last time, who do we decide to see, has one of its most interesting answers, not in history books, but in a commercial. A television commercial. Japan, 1982. A young actress appears on screen. She is elegant, composed, dressed in soft colours, and she says something that at the time was considered borderline scandalous for Japanese primetime television. She looks directly into the camera and says, "Hey everyone, if our hands are dirty, we wash them right, and the same goes for our sensitive areas. They deserve to be cleaned too." The product she was promoting was the washlet, an electronic toilet seat with an integrated bidet function, warm water, adjustable temperature, a gentle spray, a heated seat, a built-in air dryer. The reaction in Japan was immediate and split almost exactly down the middle. Half the country was intrigued. The other half was deeply uncomfortable with the idea that anyone, least of all an actress on national television, would openly acknowledge that going to the bathroom was something human beings did. Here is what I find fascinating about that moment. The washlet had actually been on the market since 1982, years before the commercial aired. Toto, the Japanese sanitary company that developed it, had invested years in research. More than 300 employees had participated in testing to determine optimal spray angles, temperatures and water pressure. The first washlet was so precisely engineered that the nozzles were placed at specific degrees, 43 and 53 degrees depending on function, to prevent splashback. It was recognized as a mechanical engineering landmark. It was genuinely innovative, and for the first 2 years it barely sold, because nobody wanted to talk about what it was for. The 1982 commercial changed that. By bringing the conversation into living rooms, by making it light and direct rather than shameful and whispered, the campaign opened a door that had been quietly kept shut by the collective social discomfort of an entire culture. Toilet technology is always in some sense a social negotiation. The flush toilet took 200 years to move from Harrington's invention to widespread adoption, not because of engineering failures, but because of the infrastructure and social norms that needed to move first. The washlet's journey from invention to the home of most Japanese families happened in about 18 years. By November of 1987, just 7 years after launch, Toto had sold its first 1 million units. By 2022, they had sold 60 million. Today, the washlet is installed in more than 80% of Japanese homes. It is in train stations, department stores, hospitals, and airports. The Japanese word washlet has become in Japan the generic term for any high-tech bidet toilet, regardless of manufacturer. In a country that 50 years ago had almost no bidet culture, the washlet managed to become not just a product but a cultural fixture, a standard, an expectation. How did this happen? It was not just the commercial, though the commercial was important. Part of the answer is that Japan had a particularly strong cultural soil for this kind of technology to grow in. The concept of purity in the religious, aesthetic and social senses runs deeply through Japanese culture. Shinto Japan's indigenous religious tradition places a strong emphasis on ritual cleanliness. The act of purification misogi, which involves washing away impurity, is not just metaphorical in Japanese religious practice. It is physical, literal, bodily. This cultural predisposition toward ritual water-based cleansing meant that the idea of water rather than paper as the default hygienic tool did not feel foreign or eccentric. It felt right. Compare that to the United States, where toilet paper is so embedded in both the practical infrastructure and the cultural assumption of bathrooms, that the bidet has spent generations being regarded as either European indulgence or peculiar foreign habit. It took a pandemic-induced toilet paper shortage to make a significant portion of American consumers genuinely curious about what they were missing. Do you ever stop and wonder why certain hygiene habits feel natural when, if you look closely, they are clearly not universal? The bidet and the toilet paper debate is in a small way a window into something larger. It is the question of how deeply any culture embeds its hygiene choices into the architecture of what feels normal, and how difficult it then becomes to examine those choices from the outside. Americans find bidets strange. Much of the rest of the world finds toilet paper incomplete. Both positions feel self-evident from inside the culture that holds them. None of them are written in biology. Now I want to take us to the other end of the economic spectrum. Not because the contrast is meant to be glib, but because it is, I think, where the most significant sanitation story of the 21st century is actually being written. In 2014, the government of India launched something that has no real precedent in the history of sanitation. A national program with a single stated goal to make India open defecation free by 2019, the 150th anniversary of the birth of Mahatma Gandhi. The program was called Swachh Bharat Mission, in English, the Clean India Mission. And at the time of its launch, the scale of the challenge was almost impossible to overstate. In 2014, approximately 530 million people in India, more than the entire population of the United States, practiced open defecation. Open defecation was not in India a purely rural or poverty-related phenomenon. It was a cultural habit that cut across economic lines in ways that surprised researchers. Some studies found households that owned televisions and motorcycles, but had no toilet at home, not because they could not afford one, but because going outside had been the norm for generations. What the Indian government launched was not just an infrastructure project. It was a behaviour change campaign at a scale never attempted before. 100 million toilets. That was the target. The government built them through incentives, subsidies, mobilization, campaigns, local community organizers, celebrity endorsements, social pressure that was sometimes gentle and sometimes considerably less so. By 2020, more than 100 million household toilets had been constructed. Open defecation rates fell from 60% to 19% in the program's first 5 years. And a peer-reviewed study published in the journal Scientific Reports in 2024 found something remarkable in the data. Every 10% increase in toilets built through the program was associated with a reduction of approximately 0.9 infant deaths per 1,000 live births. When you scale that across the populations involved, the researchers estimated the program may have prevented more than 67,000 infant deaths. More than 67,000. From building toilets, the story is not without its complications. Independent researchers found that in some areas the rate of toilet construction outpaced actual usage, that households with new toilets had members who still went outside either from habit or from latrines that had been badly constructed, or because the program measured construction more reliably than behavior change, changing what people do with their bodies in the privacy of their own routines over generations of established habit that is not solved by building a structure. It requires something harder to quantify and harder to deliver a shift in what feels normal, and yet the direction of the program matters. The scale of the ambition matters. The fact that a government looked at 530 million people living without access to basic sanitation and said, "This is the priority and we are going to change it," that matters. This is the thing about the history of hygiene and sanitation that I find most clarifying when you look at it from enough distance to see the whole arc. Progress in this domain has never come from technology alone. The technology has often existed long before the social and political will to deploy it at scale. The S-bend for the flush toilet existed in 1775, but universal indoor plumbing was still not standard in American homes as recently as 1960. Germ theory was established by the 1870s, but the World Health Organization issued its first global handwashing guideline in 2009. The knowledge that open defecation kills children has been documented since John Snow mapped a cholera outbreak in 1854. But the Indian government's 100 million toilet campaign did not begin until 2014. The gap in every case is not between what we know and what is possible. The gap is between what we know and who we decide to act for. And now at the beginning of the 21st century, the sanitation story is converging with the climate story in ways that create a new set of urgencies. Every flush of a conventional toilet uses between 6 and 13 litres of water. Global toilet paper production fells approximately 27,000 trees every day, roughly one tree every 3 seconds. The manufacturing process for toilet paper alone releases substantial carbon emissions into the atmosphere each year. These are not abstract environmental concerns. They are the practical consequences of a global hygiene system designed in an era when water was assumed to be unlimited and forests were assumed to be inexhaustible. Neither is true, and the toilet of the future, whatever it looks like, will have to do something that the toilet of the present does not manage: waste with much less water, and serve the people who are currently served not at all, without accelerating the environmental crises that threaten the water supply that sanitation systems depend on. That is a complicated engineering brief, but it is not, I think, an impossible one. The history of sanitation is full of moments where the right solution was available and simply waiting for the conditions, social, political, economic, cultural, to align around it. The S-bend waited 100 years for the infrastructure to make it useful. The handwashing protocol waited decades for the institutions to endorse it. The bidet waited 40 years for a pandemic to make Americans curious. The question of our moment is whether we're willing to close those gaps faster than we have historically managed, whether we can learn from the history we have spent this entire night exploring the cost of delayed progress, the lives lost in the space between what is known and what is done, and choose to move more quickly. There is one more thread I want to pull on before we arrive at the final chapter of tonight's story. It is a quiet one, easy to miss. Throughout every era of hygiene history we have visited, from the first pit toilets of Mesopotamia to the Japanese washlet to the Indian toilet campaign, the people who benefited last from progress in sanitation have almost always been women. In the Foraker of ancient Rome, women had less privacy than men. In the medieval city, women walking to the communal latrine after dark faced risks that men did not. In Victorian factories, women's access to restroom facilities was significantly worse. In the early Apollo space program, the entire toilet system was designed around male anatomy. In India, the absence of private sanitation facilities for women was directly linked to documented cases of assault. Women waiting until dark, walking further distances, face risks that men in the same communities did not. One of the outcomes that researchers consistently find in communities where new toilets are built and used is an increase in girls' school attendance, because schools with no toilet facilities lose girls at the onset of puberty at rates that schools with facilities do not. The relationship between sanitation and women's safety and dignity is not incidental to the history of hygiene. It is central to it, and it is one of the clearest arguments for why closing the global sanitation gap is not just a health issue or an infrastructure issue, but a human rights issue. We've been on this journey together for a long time now, from the clay pipes of Mohenjodaro to the corridors of Versailles, from Semmelweis's hand-washing data to TO's hand-washing data, Toto's spray angle engineers, from the Great Stink to the Indian government's 100 million toilets. What remains, what we carry into the final chapter, is not a neatly resolved story. History rarely provides those. What it provides, if we pay attention, is a map of the choices that brought us here, and the clearest thing that map shows across all of it, across every era and every culture and every crisis, is this. When societies have decided that something matters, when they have looked at a problem and seen the people affected by it as fully human and fully worth the effort, they have solved it. Not perfectly, not immediately, but they have moved toward the solution. The only question that remains in the history of hygiene, and in every other arena of human flourishing, is who we are willing to see when we look. The last chapter of our journey tonight brings us full circle back to the three questions I asked at the very beginning, and to what this entire history reveals about the answers. Back to the body and its secrets, back to who decides what clean means, and back to the thing that all of this history at its deepest level has always been about. 4,000 years before tonight. Somewhere in what we now call Iraq, a scribe in Uruk pressed a reed into clay and recorded the opening lines of the oldest story most people have never read, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Written around 2,100 years before the Common Era, though it draws on even older oral traditions, it is widely considered the earliest surviving work of literature. The first long story human beings wrote down and chose to keep, and embedded within it in a detail that scholars of hygiene history find quietly extraordinary, is one of the earliest references to the relationship between cleanliness and what it means to be human. At the close of the epic, after Gilgamesh's long and catastrophic journey, the death of his beloved companion Enkidu, the failed quest for immortality, the confrontation with everything mortal and everything fleeting he bathes, a final bath, a return to cleanliness after grief, after wild wandering, after everything the story put him through. And the scholar Virginia Smith, in her landmark history of personal hygiene, notes something beautiful about that moment. The bath in the epic is not just a physical act, it is a readmission. Enkidu, in his wild state before civilization, did not wash. Grief in the epic is described through the body's uncleanliness. The grieving do not bathe, the dead do not bathe. But Gilgamesh at the end of his journey does. And through that act, that most ordinary, most daily, most human of acts, he returns to society, to connection, to the living world. Cleanliness in 4,000-year-old literature already meant belonging. We have travelled a long way tonight. From the mud-brick drainage channels of Mohenjodaro, 4,500 years old, still more sophisticated than what most of the world had for thousands of years afterward, to the Roman Foraker where 10,000 citizens sat shoulder to shoulder, and the greatest sewer in history carried their waste to a river that some of them then drank from. We've been to medieval bathhouses, those lively social underrated institutions that provided affordable healthcare and community to people who history later decided were too dirty to deserve them. We have walked the perfumed corridors of Versailles in the presence of a king who dressed magnificently, and for whom even the act of using the bathroom was a performance of power. We have stood in a 19th century London street where the river was so foul that Parliament could not function, and watched with enormous respect a small meticulous engineer named Basil Gett approve every single pipe of a system that still works today. We have met Semmelweis, who proved that handwashing saves lives, and was committed to an asylum for his trouble. We have watched a company in 1923 invent the fear of bad breath, and turn that invented fear into $8 million of revenue in 7 years. We have met the gong farmers of medieval London, the essential workers who kept the city from drowning in itself, and the groom of the king's close stool, whose access to the most private moment of a king's day made him one of the most powerful men in England. And we have sat at the end of this journey with the 3.4 billion people on this planet who are still waiting. All of it comes down to a single thread. Not technology, not infrastructure, not germ theory or plumbing or marketing or empire. Those are all parts of the story, but they are not the thread. The thread is the question of who counts. That is the question that has determined the trajectory of sanitation history more than any scientific breakthrough or engineering innovation. When Rome decided that its citizens needed public toilets, it built them, and built them well. When the same Rome decided that certain people could relieve themselves in the street, it passed a law saying the streets had to be cleaned once a week. And that was that. When Semmelweis proved that doctors were killing patients by not washing their hands, the institution decided that its dignity mattered more than the evidence. The patients kept dying. When early 20th century advertisers discovered that fear of body odour sold soap, they manufactured the fear, and women became the primary target. When NASA needed to build a toilet for space travel, they built it for male astronauts, and female crew members worked around the design for decades. When nations have decided that their population's access to safe sanitation matters, when they have pointed resources and will and collective effort at the problem, things have moved remarkably fast. India built 100 million toilets in 5 years. The world connected 2.1 billion people to improved sanitation between 1990 and 2024. Countries that once had almost no sanitation infrastructure now have systems that rival those of wealthier neighbours. Not because the technology suddenly arrived, because someone looked at the people who needed it and decided they were worth the effort. Let me ask you something now that we're near the end of this long journey. Think about your bathroom. Not in an idealised way, just the actual one. The tile, the temperature of the water, the bottle of whatever soap you've been using for years without thinking about it. Think about the last time you woke up at night and walked probably half asleep, probably slightly annoyed to the toilet and back. What would it mean to not have that, not in the abstract? Specifically, tonight. What would it mean to dress to walk outside to find somewhere in the dark before anyone else woke up? To do this knowing that the nearest water might not be clean, that the nearest private space might not be safe, that this is simply the arrangement that has always existed and always will, because nobody with the power to change it has looked at your situation and seen it as something that requires their attention. I am not asking this to make anyone feel guilty. Guilt by itself does not build a sewer. I am asking it because I think it is the most direct route to understanding what this entire history has been about. When we know what it means to have access to basic sanitation, when we feel even briefly what it would mean to lack it, we start to understand why the question of who counts is not an abstract moral question. It is a practical, physical, daily, urgent question, one that gets answered in policy, in infrastructure, in budget allocation, by people who may or may not have ever asked themselves what it would feel like to be on the other side of the answer. Here is what I find most remarkable about the arc of this history. Cleanliness has always been about belonging. The scholars who study ancient hygiene find this repeatedly across cultures, across millennia, across every form that sanitation has taken. The clean body was the social body. The clean space was the safe space. To be clean was to be seen as part of the community, to be part of the group that mattered to have access to the infrastructure that made ordinary daily life possible. And the inverse has always been true as well. Those deemed unclean for reasons of poverty, caste, race, gender, illness, were excluded often deliberately from the infrastructure that would have allowed them to be otherwise. The uncleanliness was not the cause of the exclusion. The exclusion was the cause of the uncleanliness. That distinction matters. It matters enormously. As we enter whatever the next chapter of human civilization looks like, with its climate pressures and its water scarcity, its growing cities and its widening economic gaps, its artificial intelligence and its reinvented toilets and its space-age plumbing. The lesson of this history is not complicated. It is almost embarrassingly simple. Progress in sanitation has happened when human beings decided that other human beings deserved not to live in their own waste. Progress has stalled when that decision was not made, or when it was made for some people and quietly unmade for others. The technology is available. The knowledge is available. The resources globally are available. What remains is the same thing that has always remained: the will. I have been thinking as I have sat with this history about what it means to spend a night with something this ordinary and this extraordinary at the same time. The toilet is funny. That is genuinely true. There is something inherently absurd about the seriousness with which I have just spent several hours discussing it. And yet, the history of what we do with our waste, how we have managed it, hidden it, celebrated engineering around it, ignored it, suffered because of it being shaped by it, is at its root one of the most revealing lenses through which to look at what any civilization actually valued. Not what it said it valued, not what it built monuments to, what it was willing to solve, for whom, at what cost. We started this journey with a question. What did toilets and hygiene look like through history? And the surface answer is everything we have covered. The clay pipes and the marble foricay, the gong farmers and the garderobe shafts, the sponge on a stick, and the $23 million vacuum system. But the deeper answer, the one that has been building quietly through every chapter of this story, is something else. They looked like every civilization's relationship with its own humanity, with the parts of itself that it found difficult to look at directly, with the people it preferred not to see, with the basic animal reality of the body and the extraordinary lengths to which power will go to pretend that reality does not apply equally to everyone. Gilgamesh bathed at the end of his journey. He came back. He returned to the world of the living, which is also the world of the clean, which is also the world of the seen, the counted, the belonging. I think that is the oldest truth in this entire history. That cleanliness, real cleanliness, the kind that comes from having access to the infrastructure that makes it possible, is not a luxury. It is not a reward for those who have earned it. It is the most basic form of belonging. And until it is available to everyone, the story is not finished. Thank you. I mean that simply without ceremony. You stayed. Through all of it, through the Roman sewers and the Versailles corridors, through Semmelweis's tragedy, and Bazalgette's tunnels, through the manufactured fear of bad breath, and the 3.4 billion people still waiting. You listened to a story about something no one talks about, and you made it through to the end. That means something to me. If tonight you learned one thing you did not know before, one small piece of this strange, unglamorous, quietly profound history, then the time was worth it. If you found yourself somewhere in the dark watches of this long night, thinking about something you had never thought to think about before, about who gets built for and who gets left behind, about the gap between what is possible and what is done, then perhaps this story was worth telling. And if it simply put you gently to sleep somewhere around the sponge on a stick, well, I fully understand, and I take no offence. There are more stories waiting, stories about other corners of human experience that seem ordinary on the surface and reveal something extraordinary underneath, about the things we touch every day without knowing their history, about the systems we live inside without seeing their seams, about the people who built the world we inherited, the forgotten ones, the unglamorous ones, the ones whose names never made it onto the monuments, the kind of stories that are best heard slowly, in the quiet hours when the rest of the noise has gone to sleep and something can actually reach you. Stay close. The next story is already waiting, and I promise it is worth the night.